How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Ganji. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, today we're going to discuss key concerns in correctional officer inmate dynamics. So these are the concerns that may be unspoken but do affect how we manage the inmate population. Some are social concerns, some are environmental concerns, some are psychological concerns. It's not all inclusive because, guys, when I was doing my research on this, guys, it could really truly be dependent on the situation, which can vary. And there's just so many things involved that can influence the dynamic between officer and inmate. But with that said, this topic is this show is to acknowledge a few of them, let you guys get an understanding that there's many influences that happen at the same time that you're trying to motivate some level of influence with the inmate. And what we'll do is we'll discuss them a little bit, discuss how they interconnect, and just have an overall dialogue. And hopefully when we post this dialogue up, we get some engagement that also can expand the dialogue. But I think this is going to be a fun dialogue. My guests today are going to be Joe Pomponio and James Ferrara. I think it's going to be a great dialogue. Let me bring them in. And guys, don't forget, I got books on the market, so check them out. List of my books are in the description. I have 2 out there on Amazon about manipulation, and then I have another 5 out there at Blue 360 Media, which I have the link to those in the description. I have another book coming out very shortly, probably within the next 30 days, for our rookies, a collection of passages and tips that should help our rookies navigate this profession. And the reason why I'm creating these books is because right now we have a lot of senior officers that are leaving, so a lot of role models that are leaving this profession. So I'm trying to fill the gap as best I can, and hopefully these books do that. All right, let me get Joe. What up, Joe?
What's happening?
Happy Sunday, Joe.
Yeah, happy Sunday there to you.
It's so weird to call Joe and find out that he's at Home Goods shopping.
Brother's got to eat, man. I got to get food. I mean,
Joe, you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Joe Pomponio. I'm a retired lieutenant from the Texas Department of Corrections, 29 years, 6 months. Currently working as an assistant jail administrator here in our local sheriff's department in the jail division, and a panel member here for Tier Talk.
Yes, and we love. Oh, there you go. I lost you for a second. And we love having you, Joe. And I also have. There he is, Butch James Ferrara. What's up, James?
Anthony, how are you, sir?
Good. It's been a while, sir. Do you mind introducing yourself as well?
James Ferrara, former Assistant Deputy Commissioner, Massachusetts Department of Corrections. Started as a correction officer, went through the ranks, served as a deputy warden, assistant superintendent at 3 different facilities, ran inmate transportation division for a while, ran the policy development and compliance unit, and my last assignment was the Assistant Deputy Commissioner of the Northern Sector for the Massachusetts Department of Correction. 35 years, 9 months, sir.
Yes, that is about 10 years more, or almost 11 years more than I'm planning on doing. I'm going to get my 25 and out. And guys, on a side note, guys, I am doing a secondary employment with Alfred Street Industries. That's a production company that does a lot of filming for some major platforms. Some of the work they have is Top Chef, Project Runway, Is It Cake? Nailed It. Anyway, we're looking to shoot another project. If you guys have any ideas of a location that meets this need specifically, it's got to be livable because we're planning on having participants there for about 3 to 4 weeks. And it also has to be isolated from the rest of the jail or the prison because we don't want interaction between these participants and the inmates. Reach out to me, GanjiAnthony@yahoo.com, GanjiAnthony@yahoo.com, and maybe we would love to discuss what the project is in more detail, just to see maybe there's some interest, because we do have some interested parties, but the more the merrier because it gives us more options. Okay, guys, so this is a great topic today. We're going to talk about key concerns in correctional officer inmate dynamics. I think these are concerns that we need to be more aware of. And again, this could be a dialogue maybe meant for our rookies, but it doesn't hurt for our senior staff or our supervisors to listen to this as well, because we all play a part in this. And I think that when we're dealing with the inmate population, it's good for us to be aware of any counter influence. So here we are, we're trying to push something, and then there could be counter influences coming from all different directions that we need to be aware of so we can be more effective. So what I thought we could do is I can go over the ones that I have. There's a couple. It's not all inclusive because I'm sure there's more that could be added. And then what we could do is we could briefly go over our perspective on that one specific concern that we discuss, and we'll do that for the ones that I have, and then I just think it will make for a great dialogue. And then I'll go last on each section, so this way I don't influence your expertise. All right, so the first thing I got right now, and again, these are things that can work against you, so just be aware of it. So when you're maintaining your effectiveness during these inmate interactions, these are things that behind the scene could be affecting you. So you always got to make sure that you understand that these things exist, I guess. Okay, so the first thing I got is staff division and rule inconsistency. So I got a quote, and then I got 3 bullets that relate to this. The quote I got so far on this is, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. In corrections, a divided staff hands power to the inmates." I've actually always said a divided staff is pretty much divided authority. So a divided staff leads to inconsistent rule enforcement, creating opportunities for inmates to exploit weaknesses. Officers with different disciplinary approaches cause confusion, weakening the facility's overall authority. So that's a systematic thing. I like that. So that brings it up from the front line all the way to the top. But trust and believe that same type of division can also push down and make the officers ineffective. And then internal staff conflicts and favoritism can erode officers' credibility, making it harder to enforce rules uniformly. So I'll start off with Joe first. But Joe, I'm sure staff division and rule inconsistencies does affect our inmate interaction dynamic. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. When you have policies and procedures that have to be enacted, it does nobody any good not to enforce them. It doesn't do any good to be consistent when you're enforcing them, because you will cause a divide in staff, because you have a good majority of staff that are there wanting to do the right thing. They want to follow the policies and procedures, but when you don't enforce them and follow them yourself, that will lead to divisions in the shift. Being inconsistent in your policy application is probably one of the worst things you can do. I've always treated my entire staff as family. So, having favoritism wasn't really an issue for me. And I let them know ahead of time, I will treat you like family, but unfortunately sometimes when kids break the rules, they have to get spanked. Being able to model yourself in front of your staff, they say lead by example, and that's the best thing you can do. Leading by example is being in the forefront, not from the rear. Being there in the mix of things, being there to help encourage, forward progress and enforcing policies and procedures, no matter what situation's going on. Without any kind of consistency and rule enforcement, you'll have utter chaos.
Yeah, and guys, obviously we see this. I've even written in my books, kind of like when inmates shop for staff. I mean, they're always going to go to the staff member who is able to enable whatever it is that they want that they're not supposed to have, at least for this part of the discussion. And sometimes inconsistency could be between partners, which is easily seen. If you're the inmate and one partner says one thing and one partner says the other, the inmate is always going to go to the partner that gives them what they want. And then that could cause conflict now or division between the two officers. And the inmate knows that, because the inmate will be quick to say, such and such told me I could. They will throw out that name, one, just to kind of maybe even gauge your reaction, but two, that's how they justify what they're doing. And then the other thing that happens outside of, we talked about divisions between shifts and whatever, or inconsistencies between shifts. The other thing that you have to be wary of is when the inconsistency comes between the officer and the supervisor. And even if there is a concern, the supervisor needs to address it in a way in which the officer doesn't feel that they were circumvented, that they feel that their authority has been questioned. And now at this point here, how do they become effective when the inmates know that they can always go to the supervisor to circumvent? I always say that when an inmate challenges something from an officer, whether it's right or wrong, because it does happen, when the inmate goes to the officer, when the inmate goes to the supervisor, the authority of that officer is kind of up in the air, and the supervisor has now the chance to do one of two things. One, address it in a way that keeps the officer empowered to some extent. Even if the officer is wrong, how do we work with the officer to correct it so they don't lose face? Or two, give it right to the inmate, which means the officer is wrong, I'll deal with it and we'll correct it. Now, the inmate doesn't need to know what the outcome of that point is. The inmate will be, the supervisor say, you know what, I'll talk to my officer. Let me get his perspective or her perspective, and then we'll figure it out from there. This way, the officer has the empowerment to correct the issue based on how they need to correct it to maintain effectiveness. What's your thoughts on that, James? Because there's a lot, man.
It's a lot to unpack there, but I do agree that corrections is a people type of operation where we're not making widgets or building homes or anything like that. We're dealing with people and trying to use our influence for the most part to get folks to do stuff that that we think they need to do. It's interesting you talk about division or different operations between partners or shifts, or in some of my later part of my career, even facilities. You would have one facility that did a better job enforcing certain directives than others, and then the staff and inmates together get confused over that when they transfer or move from one facility to the next. But I think the key is in each case is that the supervisors, whether it be first line supervisors, shift commanders, and all the way up the rank, it's very important for them to set the message and to establish the standards to get the work done. When people are all over the place with different standards and enforcing different rules, or not enforcing rules, or allowing people not to enforce rules, or in some cases allowing certain officers to overstep their boundaries. I mean, that's a supervisor's problem. And if the supervisors are a problem, that's the administrative problem. So I think it's very important that people take their roles as supervisors, extremely important, and they're strong in setting what the standards are, because I believe that, correction officers, especially at the entry level, they want to be led. They want to be taught. They want to be taught the right way. And they're all starving for leadership. So it's very important that these supervisors take that role very seriously and step up to the plate and earn that respect and lay down their standards so that we can get some continuity in the operation.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jane. And guys, just on the outside looking in, it's very important that we create a united front, because at any point when you're not united, the authority weakens because the authority gets spread. And sad thing is, it gets spread to a point where it does become very inconsistent. Our job is to work with each other, not against each other. And if anytime there's a division, there's a crack. If I was a manipulative inmate, I would look to exploit that. It's pretty much a win for me. All I got to do is keep the fuel going and keep that division. And the greater thing about this too, that's a bigger concern, is if there's inconsistency, there's a chance for an inmate to fuel conflict. And that's the bigger concern, which means that now if me and Joe aren't working on the same page, that's the first start of a separation. So now the inmate can actually continue to fuel that and make the separation possibly more aggressive. And next thing you know, now it's not so much staff conflicting over an idea or a concept, but rather it becomes personal, because the inmates will find a way to fuel that on a personal level. If you guys agree with that.
I remember clearly as a young correction officer on the 3 to 11 shift, how we struggled because we were more strict or more direct in enforcing different rules and regulations than, let's say, the 7 to 3 shift. And the 7 to 3 shift was more lax in certain areas, and it would create conflict for us. The inmates would become, conditioned to that. And a lot of times they would, you would even hear or speak with them, and they'd talk about when the 3 to 11 shift gets on that, the conditions change within the facility. But I believe that, is an overall problem, maybe an administrative problem, where, the administrators haven't detected that the 3 to 11 shift may be stronger in enforcing. Probably because the administration wasn't there for most of the 3 to 11 shifts, so they were able to run the facility a little bit different.
Yeah, and again, it does become a more systematic issue. You know what's funny, guys? I've also noticed this too, real quick, when it comes to that division. Let's say me and Joe are working together, and I do things my way. Joe does things his way. And sadly, they're in conflict, not in complementary ways. They're just in conflict of each other. That's always a concern. I mean, you could work with people that complement each other, but you never want them to be so extreme that they conflict with each other. And then the funny thing is that if an inmate comes up and tries to get me to do something and quickly says, well, Joe lets me do it, what I need to do is I need to go to Joe and make sure that Joe knows that this inmate's throwing his name around. Because having said that, if I take what the inmate says at face value, one, it is an effort to try to influence me. But let's say I hold my ground and I say, well, I don't care what Joe does, or I don't care what Officer Ponio does. You're working with me. I'm your direct officer. So at this point, that's not happening. So the problem is when I don't confront Joe, I assume that Joe is letting this happen. So now I start to get animosity towards Joe, even though it's really on me. I'm making an assumption based on what the inmate's saying instead of me having the courage to confront Joe and say, yo, this is what this inmate's saying. So now I have all this animosity against Joe that hasn't even been validated. It's literally the inmate finding a way to fuel it. And the next thing you know, I stop talking to Joe, and everything that I think Joe is doing is really an assumption. It's really an assumption. And then here's the other thing, sadly. One other thing, sadly. When you assume it, you start to see it. That's the funny thing. So Joe could do something the same as, let's say, James could, but because I've been assuming Joe is doing this, I see Joe's actions differently than James. Joe was always talking to this inmate, man, there must be undue familiarity there. Well, James is always talking to this inmate. Yeah, but I know James. So James is doing it for the right reason. You don't know. Yeah. You set this assumption that creates an unfair bias, and turns out Joe is more professional and James is getting handcuffed. Absolutely. All right, next one. Hold on, guys. It's true, though. Scary, but true. I wanted to put this in inmate gangs, influence and subculture control. So like the hierarchies, however they play out, I use gangs because I know that really is a definitive hierarchy, but there's other hierarchies in the prison. I mean, people that have been there for a while, pod bosses that may not be gang affiliated, but I just use this to show that there is a counter influence in a hierarchy of the inmate culture. So I said when the inmates fear their own more than they fear the institution, the balance of power shifts. And I'm giving an example where I figured this one out. Everybody talks about when you have safety and security concerns, put more cameras in, put more cameras in, put more cameras in. So I get it. It's good for reactive measures, evidence, whatnot. Maybe proactive a little bit to deter, maybe. But at the end of the day, if an inmate has something they need to do, they're going to risk getting caught by staff because they don't want to get punished by the inmates who want them to do it, because they know staff does have some limits in how punitive we could be, where for whoever they're subordinate to on the other side of the culture, they don't have limits. So they usually will make the effort because they're in survival mode. So I have gang leaders exert control over inmate behavior, often making it difficult for officers to enforce facility rules. So you got to be aware of that during each inmate interaction. Inmates may fear gang retribution. We talked about that more than institutional discipline. So that makes compliance a little bit more difficult. And unregulated inmate hierarchies can create unauthorized leadership structures that undermine staff's authority. So I'll start with James first. What's your thoughts on that, James?
So the punitive limits, you hit it right on the head. You can't stress enough that the inmate disciplinary process will be much different than what the staff and the institution or the agency has to offer, and they will neglect or not even consider what the administrative type of punishment will be for certain tasks that they're assigned to do. That's very important to understand. It's very important to put together a program that identifies who are the shot callers from the different groups, whether it be gangs or different hierarchies, cliques, cliches, and to have a handle on that, to have a set of folks who are just dedicated to monitoring that stuff in the prison. one of the best or most effective ways to, try to monitor or try to keep that stuff, at bay is we can transfer inmates around. We can pay attention to those folks who are calling the shots and really try to hold them accountable, and keep the intelligence flowing to the people making decisions. Because if you let that run unmonitored or unmanaged or untested, your facility is going to be a dangerous place to work.
Well said, James. And what's your thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Butch on that, because it's integral that you have a great STG, security threat group department, on your facility, to have your hierarchy identified, and being monitored. Most TDC facilities down here they have what they call like a chessboard that they keep in their office that identifies hierarchy on each facility, and being able to monitor the hierarchy, monitor the moves, monitor the culture on the facility or in select pods, monitoring rec yards. It's an integral tool. That's something that every facility should have. Gang members themselves who aren't actually just high up in the hierarchy really could give a care less about an in-house disciplinary from staff. Some of these guys could face, depending on the facility, the state, some of these guys could face a lot worse retributions from within their own ranks. And I know I used to keep the pressure on the hierarchy myself. Whenever something happened within a facility on a select pod, I could care less about that little low-lying gang member. I went straight to the leader, man. I kept my thumb on him. I would give him the blues. And, if you keep enough pressure on, pivotal gang leadership within a prison facility, you would be surprised how you can influence the culture of your own facility just by keeping it monitored and keeping pressure on them. But, it absolutely is a culture within a culture. It's really a culture within a culture within a culture. It's bad enough that these prison facilities are like cities within cities. Then you start adding, subcultures and cliques and different diversities on top of that, and it can make managing a facility pretty difficult.
Yeah, this is the one part that's tough, and this is where I always try to look at my senior staff, because this is really a key to managing relationships, because technically you can use the influence of people that have authority over that population to some extent, but you have to be wary that you don't fall into a position of obligation. At the end of the day, is you're not, this is not a quote quid pro quo. I mean, if I'm managing a relationship with a inmate hierarchy to develop some influence with the population, it's not because I'm going to pay them back. It's because I'm reestablishing my authority with that leader. So if I have something and for some reason that conflicts with what, let's say, the leader of this group has in mind, then as long as I'm properly supported, maybe with a supervisor on site, whatever, I will talk to whoever that highest person is and let them know who's really running this unit. And again, I'll do it politely. There'll be concerns where you have an inmate says, well, I can't be housed with this individual. Can I just be housed with this person? And the last thing I want is for an inmate to influence housing. It may come up as very subtle at first, but next thing you know, you start building things that really put your life or the life of the officer in jeopardy. So at the end of the day there is some influence they have, and it could be strategically used by the officer or by management. But you have to make sure at the end of the day that the inmate that has that influence doesn't believe that this is a relationship where I do for you and you do for me, because that's where you start to lose control of that balance. And this, to me, is where you really need the rookie officer to have a good, strong senior role model here, because you have some good senior role models that know how to walk up to those inmates that have some authority, and they just got this mutual respect with each other where things work. There's no, I do this for you and you didn't know, to be honest with you, you see that if I'm in, this is for our rookies. Think about it this way too. If you're trying to establish a rapport with inmates that could have some influence on the unit. The last thing you want to do is establish a rapport through obligation, because that's what the inmate is going to try to push, because they're thinking that you're in desperation mode. So what I'm going to do is, you want me to help you out? I can help you out. But in the meantime, can you give me this little small thing? And these small things will develop into something bigger if you take a step back and realize, like, what the hell you're doing. Where if you have a good senior officer, the senior officer controls that. He doesn't ask, because this way, if I ask the inmate, that gives him an option. I'm not here to ask you. I'm here. You're going to get this done, or you're going to be held. You're going to be held responsible if it doesn't happen. So I think the senior officers approach it in a more assertive way, where the rookie officers may come off less assertive, and what would be a directive comes off as a question, in which the inmate that has a position of influence thinks they can negotiate. This isn't a negotiation, and the senior officer can express that. They'll express that this isn't a negotiation because you know how I roll, and I could back it up because I'm coming in with a reputation as well, where the rookies don't. The rookies don't have that reputation. So I think this is one area here where if you lose that senior officer, you lose out on two things that help you out here. Expectation, which is usually developed through time, and reputation. Even if I never worked with you, I've been in this facility for 20 years and people know what I'm about. So rookies don't have that. All right, so that's that part. Next one. Okay, hold on. So I have another thing that could counter influence an inmate officer dynamic is manipulation tactics and officer vulnerability. So the quote I have here is, an officer who doesn't recognize manipulation will eventually fall victim to it. So I got three areas here, just, touch on. Inmates use guilt tripping, deception, and emotional appeals to get staff to bend or break rules. So that could definitely affect the dynamic between an officer and an inmate, because that happens pretty much almost every interaction. If it doesn't go the way an inmate may want, a manipulative inmate may want, they're going to play different routes because they're looking to approach at this point here, it's very subtle. They're looking to approach the more softer side. And I always tell people, when it comes to authority, there's a balance somewhere between being assertive and somewhere between being professionally empathetic. If you start crossing into being aggressive, or if you start crossing into be solely sympathetic, that's the emotions playing out. And inmates know that if they can play into your emotions will control your efforts at decision making. And to be honest with you, correctional objectives are never subordinate to our emotions. It doesn't work that way, because that's where inconsistency comes in. So I have new officers in particular often targeted for testing to determine how much they can be manipulated. So that makes sense. And guys, when we talk about this is more about the rookie officer's initial attempt to apply their authority. So granted, if I'm a rookie, inmates will try to shake my foundation by attacking my initial level of implementing authority. And guys, that's something that you really have to be ready to defend against, because that's your anchor. That's your foundation. If you weaken at that point, then the next level will be your consistency at, issuing your authority or your correctional objective. And then officers who respond emotionally, which we talked about, or inconsistently to inmate requests, risk losing control over the interaction. So if you look about this interaction, especially with the manipulation, is a battle for control. And you really cannot allow that battle, even for a moment, to go into the hands of the inmate. We'll start with Joe first and James, because there's a lot there as well. What's your thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, I always told my cadets coming through the academy that, if an inmate's lips are moving, you're being manipulated. Just so they would be in the mindset to expect a lie or some sort of manipulation tactic, every time they interacted with an inmate. Standing your ground as a rookie is integral. Everybody gets challenged, everybody gets checked, whatever you want to call it. I remember doing an in and out on a cell block, and we were, putting some in the day room, and one of them didn't want to go in the day room. I'm like, you're going to go in that day room. He's like, what if I don't? I said, well, two things are going to happen. You're either going to go to your house, or I'm going to spray you and put you in that day room. I said, but either way, the end result's going to be the same. You're going to go in that day room. And, from that point on, I didn't have to worry about being checked. Some inmates do that purposely just to see where you're at, just to see if they can break your stride. They're also looking to see, if they can find a way in, because a convict is a convict is a convict. They're gonna lie, try, and fly every time they can on you, to get what they want and by any means necessary. And if they're able to shake your confidence, or otherwise try to break your authority down right off the bat, then they know that, eventually they're going to get what they want from you. They'll be able to corrupt you. They'll be able to get you to do what they want. It may start small, but it always ends big and always ends bad.
Yeah. And I just mentioned something. I love what Joe does, by the way. So we talk in absolutes. So there's the expectation of the higher security concern. And then again, knowing that that's in the back of your mind, then you're able to navigate the interaction. It doesn't work the other way. So if Joe started talking more tentatively and saying, well, it may not have, then the problem, the foundation is not where it needs to be. So sometimes we may talk in absolutes, but that is because of the priority. You got the mindset, the intentional effort during these inmate interactions. So again, it's not to make you paranoid, but it's more to give you a heightened intentional effort. So when you're interacting with these inmates, the foundation could easily go left or right. So let me stay firm, treat it like an absolute, and then go ahead and filter my effort, my interaction with the inmate through that highest mindset. And again, not to create paranoia, because, it's more of taking the situation at hand contextually and realizing, let me just be wary of these concerns, and then go ahead, open the dialogue with a level of control that protects you, protects your peers, protects the inmates, protects the facility. What's your thoughts on this, James? Because there's a lot here. Oh, you're muted, James.
I had my dog barking. I had to keep him quiet. So, you put yourself in the shoes or the boots of a new correction officer, and we all remember how that was. And the first day walking in, on the job, where it was a constant battle between, there was a constant psych battle going on, and here we are on one end of it, right? The inmates are experienced prison residents. They're experienced with the game. They know the correction officers, and now they know who's new and who ain't, and who has experience. So the manipulation is going to start almost immediately. I can't stress enough to a newer correction officer where, it's the most power that they can have is to be consistent, but also know what's right and wrong. So your policies, your procedures, the rules that you have to enforce to get by, and you do that. And it's much easier to say no at first and then find out that there's some room, official room, to maybe loosen that no up a little bit. Excuse me. But, I never remember an incident where I lost my cool or my temper, where the outcome was what was desired. And I really never had a problem with too much empathy. My personality, my background, I couldn't fake it. I really did not have inmates who came to me with information like they came to other staff. But I had some other strengths that other staff didn't. So new correction officers have to find their way and have to find their technique to be effective. The bottom line is you have to have influence to get people to do stuff that they don't want to do. And how you get that done within the parameters of the guidelines that are set up, I think, is the key. And knowing what is right and what isn't is so powerful, because that's where you get your confidence. If you know what you're talking about and you've, before experience, saying no at first is the strongest thing that you can do within reason. I've seen folks go the wrong way as well. But experience and time behind the wall is really all it's, that's really going to, sharpen your skills.
No, I agree. And I want to mention something too. Being tested by the inmate population, you have to assume that's going to happen. It's a safe expectation. But I would actually welcome it, because it gives you a chance to see how you're going to react to it. Again, if you have good senior staff that's next to you, They're going to probably want you to see, want you to go through these challenges, and they'll be there making sure that if you do make a mistake, it's reversible. They'll never let you fall to a spot where the issue can't be reversed. But with that said, I love when an inmate tries to test you and then you're able to catch it and call it to the surface, because as I said, if it's subtle, if it's guilt trip and shit like that, I call them out. Hey, what are you trying to do here? And then try to basically make sure whatever the concern is, the responsibility, the accountability is pushed where the direction, in the direction it needs to be at. So I would actually utilize these as teachable moments, and then go ahead, and if you're being challenged, before you start questioning yourself about why they're coming to you, set the standard. During that interaction, call them out to the surface, because we've all, I'm sure at one point or another, have been tested, and the test is going to vary. Like what James said, hey, I wasn't tested on the softer side, but maybe inmates tested me on the more aggressive side. Or for me, I was tested all the time on the softer side. So it really does matter on how you carry yourself. But I will tell you one thing, though, the moment you stand up and you call them out on it, I don't care if it's awkward or not. Call them out of it. I don't care if you're wrong or not. Just call them out. Go with what your gut says. Eventually, the tests start to stop, because I think the moment you call them out, they start to realize who you are. So you can't be afraid to pull whatever that stuff is underneath the surface to the surface. Show them a mirror. This is what you're trying to show me. So explain that to me, because I'm not understanding what you're trying to get at. Because trust me, they could run you around in circles, they will, and then you wind up getting lost in whatever game they're trying to play. So next one I got, this is unique because this does add to our influence with the inmate dynamic, is overcrowding and high tension environments. So the quote I got here is, when space and resources are scarce, tempers rise and control weakens. So we got limited space and resources, for example, showers, phone, recreation, heightens competition, leading to more conflicts. Higher inmate to staff ratios increase response times and reduce officers' oversight. And prolonged confinement with little access to structured programming or recreation can fuel frustration and violence. So granted, guys, these are in the background every day. So these are things that when you go to try to exert some influence, you got to realize something. Sometimes the environment itself, like overcrowding or high tension, is going to fuel that interaction, and you're going to be very limited as to what you can do, because you're not in control of this outcome. All you're in control of right now is being aware of it and the effort that you put back in, not allowing this outcome to make you feel like you're hopeless in every interaction. Because everybody's probably right now, a lot of people are probably dealing with overcrowding, lack of resources. So if I have an inmate that comes up to me that somehow is frustrated over these matters, I could just push it aside and just say, well, you know what, you got to deal with it, and, fall into that same hopeless mindset. And then that actually sucks, because once that hopeless mindset, you accept it all, where technically you need to actually further that engagement, further confront that challenge, and basically try your best to mitigate those concerns within the authority that you do have, which at this point may be very limited. But basically what I'm trying to tell you is that you can't allow this avenue to create such a big counter influence that you accept it. Because the moment you accept it, you're going to pretty much, it's going to pretty much make the inmates a little bit harder to manage. What's your thoughts on this? I'll go with James first.
Isn't it interesting, Anthony? And the first thought that comes to my mind, and I've had this thought recently with the number of I have the information, excuse me, now I understand it. Excuse me. All of the prisons or facilities that have closed, we were in a sense where overcrowding wasn't an issue, but when we closed mothballed these facilities, now we took those inmates out of those facilities and crowded them all into other facilities. So I mean, it's interesting where we started, many years ago, where overcrowding was a big issue. And I asked the commissioner at one time, in a question and answer period, I got the opportunity to ask him a question, and I asked him, what are some of the biggest challenges you think we have in the future? And he mentioned overcrowding. Then at the end, in my career, I had facilities that they weren't empty, but they were at capacity, and what a difference it was to manage those facilities. But those are, if you're dealing with an overcrowding issue, you have to pay attention to the climate of the facility and try to mitigate those issues in any way that you can, whether it's to extend, and use your staff. Sometimes they have some really good answers, whether you extend outside the cell activity, outside the pod activity, open the yard for longer. Different parts of the country, it's difficult to do that. Gym access, maybe some, extended visits, canteen, there's all kind of different things, or commissary that you can, take a look at and see if you can, make it a little bit more manageable to keep that climate under control, because you guys know, when we can't manage those things and we start to have those things impact day-to-day operations, that's when our jobs get very difficult, trying to keep a climate that's conducive to, rehabilitation and just manage and control. Those are very, very difficult conditions with overcrowding. You mentioned showers, you mentioned food, all of those things contribute to inmate behavior. Excuse me.
And you know what? I want to add something before we get to Joe. You mentioned something that was spot on. I know James had to step out for a second, but hey, he mentioned something that was spot on. When you introduce, like when you're going through these troubled times and you decide that, maybe we should introduce maybe some extra commissary, maybe if we could afford extra rec time, whatever it is, to show that there's an effort. You really can't wait too long, because if you lose credibility in the process, then the efforts become superficial. So they have to make sure that the efforts are timely. So if you're doing a bunch of lockdowns because, let's say, there's concerns with staffing, whatever it is, and it's like, hey, we better get something done pretty quick. Let's go ahead and say, relevant to this one issue here, let's go ahead and say, I know we had recent lockdowns this last week. So today for the population, we're going to try to do our best to give you guys extra rec time, blah, blah, blah. You try to make it more immediate to that concern, as opposed to letting it drag on, letting it pile up, and then say, what? Yeah, we've been doing this for 6 months now. Let's give them a bone and let's give them a little extra rec time. Well, now there's no credibility. You waited too long. You got to try to do it, when feasible, and then make sure it's connected to that moment. Because if you wait too long, as I said, those are good attempts that James said. Whatever one's more reasonable for your facility, just to name a few. But the timing of those attempts matter, because you want to make sure that they see it as an honest attempt, as opposed to more of, yeah, let's just give them a bone right now. And usually that happens when you don't attempt to do anything more immediately, because the problem is, believe it or not, time matters. If I address it more immediately, there's a sense of urgency that the population will feel, and they'll reflect that urgency and know we worked on something immediately. But if you wait too long, the mindset's not there for that to be introduced, and it will wind up happening. And this is the funny thing: it could wind up going against you, because now you're introducing something that in their mind does not equate to what they've gone through for the last couple of months. So they may turn around and, if it's introduced a lot later, that good effort becomes, that's just all you're doing. That's just all you're doing. And that just does become a problem. What's your thoughts? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But when it comes to lockdowns, it depends on why the lockdowns are taking place. Is it because of contraband issues? Because of assaults and fights? We still got to maintain an upper hand in maintaining our facility. Along with overcrowding and high tension environments. The one thing I always throw in there is a well maintained facility. If your facility is not well maintained, if you got 2 out of 3 toilets in every section that are broken, and you got 100 people in there, it's going to cause you problems. You have to have a well-maintained facility in order to keep, the morale up. Not, 100 inmates don't want to use the same toilets or the same shower, or, the TV in their day room area has been been broke for 6 weeks. You know, there are small things that you can do to, you know, ease the tensions in the environment. But you have to have a well-maintained environment first off. You know, as far as overcrowding, I think there's a lot of facilities that are probably overcrowded at this point, mine included. You know, the way you deal with it is the best that you can with what you got. You know, budgetary, there you have budgetary restrictions too, you know, especially coming from a state to a county like I did, man, has been a eye opener. I don't have all that state money anymore that I used to have access to when I was with Texas DOC. You know, the counties are county by county by populace, and you only get so much money to do certain things. And when you're overcrowded, you know, and you're above your population numbers, a lot of things suffer. Your food budget, your recreation budget, you know, there's a lot of things, you know, wear and tear on clothes. You know, we just got, you know, for our facility, I finally got us, you know, brand new washing machines, brand new stoves, brand new bread warmers, you know, just all kinds of stuff that this facility has been needing in order to make it a more safer and smoother running operation. You know, there's a lot of things that come into play when it comes to high tension environments such as corrections. You know, it's not just the fact that these guys may get locked down for 6 weeks. You know, if you have a poorly maintained facility, I've seen where that's caused more issues than, you know, maybe the phone system's down for 2 hours because, you know, there's an internet outage, or, you know, or the TVs are down because there's an internet outage. You know, I've seen where, you know, having facilities with poor functional, basic life amenities has caused more issues than, you know, what people would normally think would cause issues in a prison system.
Yeah, and the last thing you want to do, guys, is if you fall trapped in basically hopelessness, then you're going to come across as being hopeless, and eventually the inmates feel hopeless. Now you're managing a hopeless population. I think that's probably one of the worst things any facility would want, is to manage a population that's hopeless. So somewhere along the line, we have to figure this out. And again, that's going to be different for each facility. I think we can maybe guide you in what direction you may have to take, which we just did. But the key here is that if you are hopeless and you're trying to manage inmates with that hopeless attitude, good luck. Good luck. Because when you start to manage hopeless individuals, it's not going to go in your favor. Hopeless individuals just don't give a shit.
Anthony, can I?
Yeah.
Joe brought up some extremely good points about maintaining the facility, and we talked about a number of things that the new or rookie correction officer is listening, but they really don't have the authority to do anything that we just mentioned, right? So I think it's very important to know that their role in this would be when toilets or showers or those types of things start not to work, that they take the time to verify that and then report it so that those things can be put on a list to be repaired. The TV system may break or go down, phones may be an issue, and that's all stuff that needs to be reported. And I've seen where, you know, housing unit officers may not, you know, may be doing some self-punishment and think, good, you know, I'm glad it's not working, but they have to understand the impact of that. And then, you know, to make sure that they report it so that they can get it fixed so that it doesn't impact the climate of that facility, because that does contribute to tension and, you know, the hopelessness of not only, you know, the staff, but, you know, the inmates alike. I thought that was a great point by Joe. You know, that the facility operations side of the house really needs to make sure that they maintain and upkeep their facility and make sure that ratios of showers and toilets and sinks and that type of stuff, those are all of, you know, the daily living conditions that impact, you know, institutional climate and behavior.
Yeah, and I guess, you know what, and you're dead on. You know, the expectation of the facility must have a default of a maintained facility, not of a facility that has the perspective of a facility that's poorly managed. So technically, the rookie officer or the officers on the front line, with the support of their supervisors and obviously management, must make sure that they keep that expectation alive, because the moment it shifts towards a default where this is the norm, then the problem is people accept that, and then eventually that's where it falls into some level of hopelessness, which becomes harder for the inmates to be managed.
Amen.
I like that. You're right. I agree with that 100%. Now, to be funny, this kind of crosses into this, actually. I put officer fatigue and burnout. That could affect our inmate officer interaction. So I have a tired officer, a vulnerable officer, both mentally and physically. And I got a couple of bullets here on this one. I have, again, these may be concerns that are out of our control, but you got to understand that this is the hard thing, because we really don't have an answer right now to solve these concerns. But the problem is you can't get to a point where you accept them either. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. You may not be able to change the outcome, but that doesn't mean you can't. That doesn't mean you have to accept it either. I guess that's part of what I'm trying to say. That's to keep the positive mindset, being realistically optimistic. Like, I know we're going through these things, and I got to do one or two things. I could accept it as it will always be that way, or I could still maintain some level of optimism and not accept it, and then have that hope in the back of my mind, which is what I try to translate. If I can't put hope in the situation because I can't control the outcome, I could push hope to the people that's around me that I trust that will make it through. And I think that's a great way to put your hope. So we got long shifts, mandatory overtime, and high stress environments increase emotional exhaustion and irritability. Burned out officers may become either too aggressive or disengaged, which affects security and decision making. And then fatigue can slow reaction time and impair judgment, leading to unnecessary confrontations or security lapses. I find out right now also when you have burned out staff, they become a little bit more disenfranchised. And then what happens there, if you have disenfranchised staff, then you wind up having more entitled inmates because they take advantage of that. I know for senior staff, they could become burned out because of just the persistent concerns that are happening, that they're just tired. And then the inmates will also see that and say, hey, you know what? So if I'm a little bit more persistent, staff is kind of giving up a little bit. So I could just keep on being more persistent because all I need to do is just have an ounce more energy than they do at that point. And again, when you walk into a unit and you see officers that are burned out, if you look the other way, you're going to see inmates that are, they absorb that energy, and now you got disenfranchised versus entitlement. And we can't allow that at any level to be accepted as the norm. That's the key. So I'll have you go first, Joe.
Yeah, when you take a high stress facility already, due to the number of incidents that it has, and you combine short staffing, long shifts, officers that are there on 2 or their 4 days off, working extra days because we're mandated, on top of everything else that goes on a daily basis, burnout and fatigue can come quickly. For me as a lieutenant, I always found it to be part of my job to be down there in the trenches with them. So, if they were in the chow hall fighting, I was in the chow hall fighting with them. If they were on a pod having issues, I was on the pod having issues with them. A leader's job role, not just, to keep them safe, to keep them, to keep them where they leave the facility the same way they walked in, upright on their own 2 feet. We're also tasked with their emotional and mental well-being too. We can't just continue to drive on these guys and run them to the glue factory without offering some sort of help. But at the same time, I tell the officers that we will never accept defeat. It'll never be. And I'll never forget, we had one pod at a facility that I got moved to temporarily to help out as a lieutenant. And this guy would set his cell on fire every freaking day, every freaking shift. I mean, he did it so much that the entire pod was sooted up. The cameras didn't even work in there because it was so sooted up. Back then the use of force plan said that if you had to open the door to extinguish the fire and he got hit with the water, it was considered a use of force. So on this one day in particular, the boss calls me on the radio, hey, he's at it again. And, this officer in particular had been there for 3 of his 4 days off, and they were having to work 16-hour shifts. So you could hear the defeat in his voice. And I went down there and we got the fire hose, and I instructed the officer to open the bean chute, and he kind of looked at me crazy. And I said, open the bean chute. And he opened the bean chute, and we extinguished the fire. We started at one wall, and I made sure that it was extinguished all the way through the other wall. And when we were done, he's like, I'll start the use of force report. I said, that wasn't a use of force, son. We didn't have to open the door. And I mean, just that quick, the light came back on to him, and he was charged and ready to go. So, there are little things as leaders that we can do to help keep the morale amongst your shift, especially when they're having to work these extra shifts, when they're having to work, I even volunteered 2 of my days off just to come in with my shift that were being mandated to work overtime on another shift. Hell, if they're working the overtime, I'm going to work the overtime with them. Being part of the solution and not part of the problem is the best thing you can do.
I agree with that, Joe. And James, what's your thoughts there?
So remember how earlier I said that I asked the retiring commissioner what are some of the biggest issues we may face in the future, and at that time was overcrowding. I think if someone asked me that question when I was retiring, I would have said staffing levels and trying to maintain the appropriate staffing levels so that we don't have this crisis. So that is definitely one of the number one issues on every operational administrator's mind from day to day, is to make sure, or trying to figure out how they're not only going to have enough well-rested, high-performing staff on duty from shift to shift, but they're just hoping to have enough people in general. And they probably have most of them that are fatigued and if not burnt out, on the verge of burning out. So very, very difficult problem, and contributes to the climate in the facility, of course. I really don't have an answer for it other than these agencies need to strive hard to recruit. They need to get the money to keep hiring, keep the classes going through, keep the cycle going. One of the things, the benefits, tickle in my throat, of closing these facilities, there's some short-term benefits because they take the staff from the facility that closed and they put them in the facilities that are that are short-staffed, and it fixes it for 6 months, 7 months, and then after a short period, a year comes around and they're back in the same situation because they haven't been able to replenish the staff that have retired. The conditions in prisons and jails all over the country have changed over the years. The jobs become much more. I'm not sure if I want to use. It's much more of a challenge to be successful. I think people have different expectations of what our jobs are. So, it is the number one issue, and administrators nationwide are trying to come up with solutions to address those. I've seen, just in the local area, I've seen salary benefits. They're giving $25,000 to staff to sign up and come to work. Incentives, those types of things. They're looking at different things. There's a local sheriff that claims, he's going to give everybody a piece of the weekend. I'm not sure how he's going to do that. I'm very interested in paying attention to that. But it's a challenge for everyone. But you have to have the administrators and the shift commanders really need to understand and be able to identify those folks that need a rest and need a reassignment. Excuse me. So that maybe we can rotate staff into some of them more difficult, assignments, and give some people some breaks from time to time. Yeah,
I always tell people while we're going through these concerns, sometimes those temporary fixes are there because you have people in the positions that are only temporary anyway. So they look to fix it only for their time there because, again, they're not thinking long term. They're just thinking about enough, to fill the need while they're there. More vanity as opposed to really investing in something long term. And I do say, like, for our staff that are going through it, what helps you go through it now is more peer-to-peer accountability. Working with each other so we can, hopefully mitigate the concerns why someone does develop that long-term plan. But I would like also people to know that you do got to have a positive mindset, because at the end of the day, if you're burned out, and that mindset really doesn't help you stay motivated, you accept things and the energy is not there. So you take shortcuts, you do things that are more convenient, and ultimately the safety of the security slowly starts to erode. It's really nothing that you see surface until, it piles. So, you let go of 1 inch and then next week it's 2 inches. And the sad thing is the default of the facility is where it's at now when you enter, as opposed to where it should be, if that makes sense. So if I'm coming in as a rookie and I go into this prison that's operating at 50% what it should be, my default of this facility being as effective as it is actually 50% low. But I don't know that, because that 50% is my 100%. So now eventually what happens is, through time, the effectiveness of that facility actually is a lot less than what people are shooting it for or shooting to get it back to, because they don't know what that facility is 100%. They only know what that facility is at when they've entered. That's why we need to make sure that we fight as best we could to maintain that 100% effectiveness. And when I mean 100% effectiveness, I don't mean that as a subjective interpretation of what you feel it should be, but rather what we know it should be. And I think that's a big concern right now, too, when it comes to fatigue and burnout. Sometimes we want the facility to kind of run with the least amount of energy because we don't have the energy to give. And then when the day is successful, we accept that the day is successful because, it was 100% where it was supposed to be. And it wasn't. It was just not draining on you. But technically, it wasn't 100% of where it needs to be. And I it's what we accept as the default is a problem for me when we're burned out. The least amount of energy to keep that facility running winds up becoming the default. And that really doesn't mean it's a truly effective facility. It just means it's a easy facility. And I don't like that. I don't think those terms should work well together. Okay, so the next one I have, this is a unique one. I think this does have an influence. Contraband and black market economy. So the quote I have here is, where there's a demand, there will be supply, even behind bars. So again, guys, we're talking about things that could influence the interaction between staff and inmate. So I got drugs, weapons, and cell phones fuel unauthorized inmate trade and create security risk. Inmates in debt to contraband suppliers may become involved in violence, extortion, or escape attempts. So you got to be aware of that. And that staff who fail to detect or control contraband allow inmates to establish their own economy and power structure. And I'll be honest with you, this is probably one of the biggest dangers that we have in correctional facility is unpaid debt. We'll start with James first, but this definitely does have an influence on our staff and inmate interactions.
Most of your time as administrators will be dealing with these types of issues. When there are drugs and contraband in your facility, you have major breakdowns in many different areas. I agree with you, Anthony. Unpaid debt is the number one reason for the fights and beatdown in the facility. It's the number one things where rival forces have issues trying to compete. It's just like Joe said, it's a city inside these walls. So we experience the same things that cities and towns experience, but we do it at a smaller scale within inside the perimeter of facility. There are many different things out there and techniques to fight and trade craft for the correctional professional to fight and to reduce the amount of contraband that's brought into a correctional facility. There are many different studies out there. You don't have to look, the Danorama up in New York was they publicized their internal investigation on the number of breakdowns that they had within their security operations that led to that escape and that terrible incident. You've had many of folks come on and talk about they've been manipulated or they fell in love with an inmate and started bringing in contraband and what the results of those decisions were on people and the agency. It's the biggest game of cops and robbers going in the world. And I will tell you this: there are many people in the correctional profession that have the ideas, have good, solid trade craft to prevent it, but there's a lot of outside sources outside our profession that don't think that it's that big a deal or that dangerous, and they almost think that inmates should have the right to get high in prison to make the time go by faster. I think that there's a lot of people out there that that are getting away of us managing contraband inside the facility as opposed to helping us. But it is the number one problem. It takes a lot of effort. It goes back to the intelligence and investigative or intelligence gathering, knowing who the players are, follow the money, who's getting money into the facility, who's shipping money out. There's so many different things. And one of the things, after being retired, that I've noticed that they sensationalize. I've noticed this for a while, but they sensationalize when a correction officer brings in contraband into a facility. Yet, they forget about all the other branches of our profession and on outside the walls. For example, everyone knows a nurse that worked in a hospital. Knows of a nurse that worked in a hospital that may have been stealing drugs. A dentist, a dentist assistant. Everyone that works in corrections knows about an attorney that was part of the process to get contraband inside a facility. Everyone knows a doctor or some other profession or different part of politicians. I know politicians that contributed to contraband coming in the facility, but they seem to sensationalize when a correction officer does it. And I'll be the first to tell you that, we've spent many, many thousands of hours in hard work to catch people who do that. And the punishment just does not fit the crime. And it's tough to even get a prosecutor to bring the right charges to make it a detriment to folks who are working in corrections. It's very, very frustrating. But there are there's a lot of technology out there today that can assist administrators in reducing the amount of contraband that comes in the facility. And those facilities that do a good job at it are a better facility, not only for the staff, but the inmates alike. It becomes a facility that has a climate that's conducive to learning and somewhat rehabilitative issues. So it's very, very important to sharpen the skills and do the things necessary to help reduce that contraband coming in the facility.
Yeah, and guys, when you work in a prison or jail and you have people that can't control bad habits like drug use or gambling, predators will take advantage of that. And then actually, the funny thing is when they say victimless crimes, it really, they're not victimless crimes, especially drug use, because when you're in debt, eventually what's going to wind up happening is these families the inmates are going to put pressures on their family. I need money. If I don't pay out, they're going to kill me. And then the family winds up being oppressed, because they don't want their loved one to be hurt. And then it puts pressure on the facility. It's like, well, no matter where we put this individual, they can't control that habit. So we'll move them to another facility, let's say, and they start their drug habit there with new people. They can't pay back. And no matter what, it's at one point, it's not the facility. It's not even the people that are, sadly giving them the stuff, to be honest with you, which we don't want anyway. But I'm going to put it's on that person's willpower to say no. So no matter where you go, you got to realize in corrections, there is going to be that type of environment. And The people need to have the willpower to try to break themselves free of whatever those demons are. But you do have inmates that are predators that will attack those demons, and the inmates that are weaker will fall victim to that. And no matter where you go, they're going to incur debt. And it is what it is. And as much as you try to go ahead and protect that individual, they need to protect themselves. We could do what we can, but if they're the consistent concern, when do we start looking at that individual? But you need to know that during those interactions with an inmate, that these are external pressures, that an inmate could be acting in a certain way because they have incurred debt or they have gotten themselves involved in something that if they don't follow through, the penalty will be a lot more severe than you could ever carry out. What's your thoughts on this, Joe?
Yeah, contraband is probably one of the oldest forms of cops and robbers within a prison setting. They've always tried to manipulate ways of getting it in, and thanks to technology, 25, 30 years later, they've made it easier. I mean, I just read a thing the other day where two idiots down there in Beaumont got arrested because they were using an air cannon to shoot contraband over the frickin' fence. I sent Anthony an article the other day about a warden who was arrested because she was allowing contraband to come through her back gate because she shut down the searches so that contraband can come in the back gate. It doesn't affect just correctional officers. I've seen it affect nurses. I've even caught chaplains who got caught up in the game. It doesn't just affect, correctional officers, although they sensationalize as correctional officers. They really don't have a clue that, it affects more than just, COs. I've seen it affect medical personnel. I've seen it affect chaplaincy. I've seen it affect, a multitude of different areas. And, contraband always has been and always will be one of the biggest things that we fight in a correctional profession. Now we're, like I said, technology's coming along. Now we're dealing with, on top of the K2 and all this other crap that's, coming into our facilities because they're short staffed, because there's nobody at the front entrances or rear entrances to shake people down. No kind of contraband interdiction programs whatsoever because we're so totally understaffed that we have negated these. Therefore, the contraband continues to flow. But now we're putting tablets in their hands. They're hacking those, accessing porn sites and kiddie porn and all this other crap. Contraband affects a facility, but is contraband going away anytime soon? Absolutely not. As long as they make a prison or a jail, there's always going to be contraband in some form or fashion. All we can do is the best with what we got. We try to, try to stop it from coming in, try to stop it from going out, because I've also done outbound shakedowns on staff too, coming out with a wad of money. Well, the hell did you get this from? Knowing it's illegal for COs to bring that much money, to bring money into the facility anyway. So, there are things that we can do to curb the contraband. We just have to make it a practice to do it. If you, and I told staff before, as an administrator, if you got time to go out in that parking lot and smoke a cigarette, you got time to stand your ass up here in that lobby and shake somebody down. We have to apply ourselves to do it. We can't keep leaning on, well, we're shorthanded. We're shorthanded. Everybody's fucking shorthanded. Everybody is shorthanded. All we're doing is we're accepting the fact that we'll never stop the contraband, so we just quit looking for it. And that's a mindset we need to get out of. We need to be more proactive. Damn the excuses. I don't want that shit in my facility. And, you have a handful of convicts that actually come to prison with the mindset, while I'm here, I'm going to get an education. I'm going to get a college degree, some sort of vocational trade. Trying to do the right thing and actually trying to, do something with his incarceration that will make him a better person when he gets out. He doesn't want to be caught up in a tank where people are fighting and flopping and swimming in their own feces because they're high on K2. So what is the answer to, the total short answer is quit accepting defeat. If you got time to make a telephone call, if you got time to go out in the parking lot and smoke a cigarette, if you got time to go to the vending machine and get you a candy bar, you got time to shake somebody down. It don't take you all you need to do is get lucky once, and the word gets out. I do believe that for the staff that bring it in, I think that our local district attorneys, which, ours is good here. But, anywhere there's a county jail or a prison facility within their designated counties, I think they need to be willing to accept and take on the charges, because, a lot of facilities don't have prosecutors that are willing to accept the charges for the staff or for the individuals introducing contraband into the facilities. They let them resign in lieu of disciplinary. They make them non-rehirable, and that's it. That's the only penalty they get, and that doesn't send a message. Get one good time and give them a good 10-year sentence. Let the word get out.
You're spot on with that, Joe. And I want to mention something before we close this part off, is that the counter influence on this black market thing is insane, because you're competing against the immediate reward of either something monetary, a feeling of being high, or a status, if it's a weapon, whatever it is, or the immediate discipline. So the fear of what could happen if something's not accomplished in regards to the contraband, because it could affect someone's immediate reward. There's no way you can compete with that. And I think that the reason why officers are always looked at is because a lot of people believe that when drugs or something come in, the first thing they say is, how could the officers allow that to happen? So their perspective is that the officers sit down there, and it's funny because no one takes into account that the officers are not allowing it to happen. It's not like, you come in and say, yes, go bring it in. Sure. Bring in the drugs. Yeah, sure. Bring in the weapons, because if they're doing that, they're not officers. They're inmates, no different than what we're overseeing. I like the fact that people just forget that inmates are in survival mode. They become very innovative. So like Joe said at the very beginning, cops versus robbers, it's true. You're always chasing after it, because the moment you discover a route, they change it, and then it goes on to the next route. So it's funny how when drugs come in, because the inmates are being innovative and we're still chasing after it, it gets equated to that we're allowing it. And then that's not the case, is that we're just never ahead of it. And it's an impossibility, because we're always reacting. We try, but the moment we get to, and here's the other thing about this, and I don't know if people have ever seen the conflict of this, but it happens. The moment you identify a controlled way, or the moment you identify a way that contraband's coming in and you go to seize it, is the moment it will be in another area that you're not familiar with. So now people are thinking like it's the devil I know versus the devil I don't know. Could I monitor this and then just be weary a little bit, or do I attack it and then all of a sudden it pops up somewhere else that we don't know about? So it's funny how people think that, it's easy, and it's not. It's very strategic. It's very strategic. And okay, we're ready to go after this. Yes, let's go after it, but then be ready, because we have to have our sources in play, because when we do this, it's going to change plans. So I want to make sure that we're ready to have the sources let us know what's the quick outcome, because the more immediate you can address it, the more that other side starts to become disenfranchised. So usually if you're attacking one channel, you're already prepared to attack a few other ones that you got word that if you close this channel, the water is going to start going out this way. Okay. And again, this does affect, however, the capacity, interactions with the inmate and officer dynamic. All right. So this one's interesting here. We kind of touched on this a little bit, so if we have to speed through it, that's fine. Perceived fairness and rule legitimacy. So when rules are not seen as fair, they're seen as negotiable. We just kind of touched on that. If inmates believe officers enforce rules unfairly, they're more likely to challenge authority. Favoritism, arbitrary discipline, or unclear policies create resentment and fuel resistance. And when inmates lose trust in staff enforcement, they may resort to inmate-led discipline, escalate in violence. So we touched on this before. Basically, we don't want emotions involved in rule enforcement. It needs to be extremely objective, and inmates will try to play into your emotion, to try to gauge favor or some level of bias in how you enforce the rules. So we kind of touched on that. But the one area here that I brought it, made it a little bit separate was where it says if inmates believe, where is it? Favoritism, arbitrary discipline, or unclear policies. It's the unclear part that matters. So this may start with management above, but really technically as an officer, you got to truly understand what you're putting out there, how it must be done, and more. And probably the most important thing is why, because that why gives you the consistency that you need to stand tall. That why is your anchor. And if you truly don't understand the policies that you're trying to enforce, the inmate could play out on that ambiguity and challenge it. I mean, actually, to be honest with you, if you don't truly understand what you're trying to enforce, the inmate can play on your naivety, your what's that word? Naivete, you being naive. I hate that, but basically they could play out in your ignorance to that and actually make you very confused in how you enforce it, because they can challenge it to a point where you don't feel that you're on solid ground. So for me, it's very important that I teach my staff everything I can about the policies that are going to be implemented, because I know they're going to be challenged at many different levels, and an inmate will take advantage of someone not knowing something, because when they feel that the officer doesn't know it to that extent, they can challenge their foundation, because they'll be able to maneuver. There's no strength behind it if the officer doesn't understand the need for it. So I think they take advantage of the ambiguity of it all to create confusion, which lessens the officer's directive. And then if the officer is not fully understood on that directive or doesn't really have a strong justification, then that does lead, in my mind, to inconsistency and the manipulation of policy and procedure based on the inmate's benefit. So I'll start with Joe first. And I was pushing more towards the unclear part, Joe, but if you want to push it back on the emotion side, but I think we touched that up a little bit.
No, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, you got to have administrative clarity when you're putting in, when you're bringing out new policies and procedures. One thing that always burned my ass about being in leadership was the fact that, when something was enacted, it was enacted on paper, some sort of SOP or some sort of freaking email. And it left too much ambiguity in the application of policy. So, I perceive it one way, another lieutenant perceived it another way, 3 sergeants perceived it another way. And what happens, you turn a new policy into a freaking Three Stooges event, where, it's being applied in different manners, that can lead to total breakdown. I think it's imperative that when something comes out, that there's some sort of face-to-face application of this directive to make sure that everybody has clarity on it. Because if not, once it gets down to the inmate population, they will use that shit against you in a heartbeat. They will find the crack in the armor, the crack in the damn wall, or God forbid, the staff that play against each other on it. They'll find that wedge to kind of push people to the sides there. There has to be firm fairness and consistency in the way that we enact policies, the way we apply policies, and we damn sure need to make sure that our staff totally understand these policies. I've been in shift briefings where the supervisors come out and just read that shit word for word off the page, and that's it. There's no discussion. There's no, this is just a FYI thing. And, I hated that shit. When I made lieutenant, I wanted to make sure that anything that we applied as a shift, that they fully understood. I wanted no ambiguity. I wanted no, and I would give them ample opportunities in these shift briefings to ask questions, because I wanted to make sure I was doing my job as a lieutenant to deliver the right information and to make sure they understood the information, just so there was no inmates population. If you don't apply something correctly and you leave any ambiguity up to an inmate, trust me, they're going to find it. They're going to find a way to manipulate it. They're going to find a way to use it to their advantage. They're going to find a way to use it towards you somehow. we just need to make sure that whatever we apply, that there's a clear directive and that everybody understands it, because failure to do so, I'm telling you, it will give your own shift the blues. Because when you have 6 people applying the same rule 3 different ways, it will create havoc for you. It will create havoc for the offender population.
Yeah, and you want to hear something funny? When I put perceived fairness, the perceived fairness really starts from the officer's objective application. I don't really care, to be honest with you. Don't get me wrong. I want the inmates to receive it well. But if I cared about each individual inmate and what they perceive as fair, I'm going to be the most inconsistent individual out there. So technically, it really has to be explained to me to where I see it as being fair as the officer, and then I can go ahead and hold that ground. Because the inmates, in their subjectivity, they're going to want you to, kind of be a little bit off balance with the different things. So I need my officer, and again, if you're watching this, you, the officer, need to be firm in what you feel is that fairness, and then that's what has to be carried out, and that should be shared with your peers, with your supervisors. There should be no manner where this is subjectively filtered to the point where fairness is subjective. We all have to be on the same page, because again, even if you're holding it to one standard, is everybody else holding it to that same standard? And that inconsistency in enforcement is what the inmates want to challenge, because again, there's just so many levers I can utilize if there's inconsistency enforcing rules. It starts really with the inmate now being able to negotiate based on comparison of staff members are doing it differently. And then it turns out that, in my mind as an inmate, is I know there's no communication here either, because if you guys were consistent with it, I wouldn't be able to note the inconsistency. So now I notice also another thing, that staff's not communicating. What's your thoughts on this, James?
That's a fantastic topic. It's hard work developing rules, and then even harder to implement them. Getting everybody on the same page and being consistent. The why is very important. People need to know why we're enforcing this rule, because it's going to take a lot of work to do it. So they need to know what the expected outcome is. One of the things as an administrator was, the need to constantly review your rules. I used to get frustrated when we would have a rule that no one enforced. Then I used to say, why do we have it? And then when I asked that question, why do we have this rule? I would get some solid responses. This is why we have it, boss, and this is why we do it. And back in this day, this is what happened. Yet, the same people that are giving me these reasons why I shouldn't delete the rule, are the people who are supposed to be enforcing it and don't. But that's a management issue. That is a management issue that rule enforcement can be monitored and we can have a strong impact if we manage by walking around and evaluating the facility and see what's going on from a day-to-day operation. It's very hard work. It sucks a lot of energy out of administrators, but if you're not out there seeing what's going on and understanding, what's going on in your facility, and understand how it's breathing and living, and which rules are being enforced and which ain't, and why they're not. And it takes a lot of hard work on. Correction officers, if they don't do anything all day, they enforce rules, whether they're written rules or they're unwritten rules, or they're overlooking rules. It's the number one job that they have, to have influence over people, to follow rules. It's the number one thing, and some of the hardest things that we do to get everybody on the same page. But I agree with Joe. We can't just, one of the things that drove some administrators crazy were memos. I never believed that that's a way to run a facility. A memo always expires at some point. We need to have, rules that are written down, and procedures or in policy that are reviewed, periodically and changed when they needed to be changed. And it's hard work, but it is really the blueprint for a correction officer, the rules that they need to enforce in their housing unit or in the property room or in the kitchen or wherever they're working. There's rules. And when we don't enforce rules, that's when we have, the impact on the climate. It's our day-to-day operation. And I agree with you, Anthony. Fairness, how the inmates perceive fairness and how we perceive fairness based on the outcome that we want, two totally different things. And on occasion, I think, we can listen and listen to those concerns and whether it's fair or not. But the outcome sometimes we need to know, the staff need to know, but the inmates sometimes don't need to know what the desired outcome of that rule is. They'll know, but it's sometimes giving away some of the intelligence, and we identify some of the things that we're trying to deter, and they'll come up with some other way. Over time, they'll learn, but I agree with you with that statement about fairness. I think you hit it right on the head.
Oh, thank you. And guys, when a decision's made that could affect the population, especially if it's a change that's really non-negotiable and it has to happen, everybody pretty much comes to the table and figures out how it must be delivered. And at that point, it's not to be negotiated. It's just, it has to be done. So at this point, the fairness, to be honest with you, of how it's perceived by the population really is, yes, it's my concern for safety and security. Don't get me wrong. But if I sit there and allow myself to make that be the priority, then the problem is I'm going to wind up finding out that I have more obstacles. And at this point, this is something that's non-negotiable. So I'm going to go towards the people that can help me carry it out and then, translate what's got to be done to the inmates. And at the end of the day, whatever their perspective may be, fair or unfair, based on usually a selfish motive, let's just put that in there. I'm talking about inmates that are going to figure out what fairness is based on selfish motives. I don't really care what their interpretation of it is. At this point here, this is what has to be done. It's been explained to you as why. However you internalize or however you feel about it, I'm sorry. It just is what it is. Go ahead and we're going to go ahead and do what we got to do. Yeah, James.
So I want you to think back about one of the big rules that we implemented, and basically we did it so effectively that we did it with the least amount of harm and damage or impact it had on the facility when we stopped cigarette smoking in the prisons. What a good job that the profession and the professionals that we have that came up with this, were given this problem, and then we took it and implemented it with the least amount of impact that it had on the facilities, the taxpayer, and the inmate population. That's a rule that came out that we implemented with the least amount of impact with a great amount of benefit.
Yeah, and you know what's funny about that? A cool part about that all was also not introducing it in a manner where it was effective the next minute. It was, listen, this was a change that the inmates may not like, so let's give them a chance to adapt and adjust to it, knowing it's happening. So this is what we're going to do in a couple of months from now. And this gives them a chance to get upset, but then start to understand that's going to happen regardless. And they have some time to figure out how they're going to deal with this. And then eventually it just becomes a few outliers there that may not accept it regardless. But with that said, it wasn't a negotiation. It was just, we knew we were going to go something that created a little bit of a paradigm shift. And then we decided to introduce it with some time, because I think that's one thing about us guys in corrections is that we know that if something's going to affect the population as a whole, especially if it's something that they're used to, that we're going to take away. So it's a lifestyle they've been accustomed to that we're now going to affect. And it could cause the inmates to unite on what they may perceive as unfair. Then we have to introduce it and then give them a chance to air out their concerns. But ultimately, the reason why we're introducing it so far ahead is because when we go to implement it, it's not a surprise. So one, they've accepted it to some extent. And then two, it doesn't put the person who's issuing it at a serious disadvantage where now all of a sudden they go to implement it and all the inmates are against them. All right, so the next thing I got is physical facility layout and security challenges. So we have a facility design dictates the battlefield. Blind spots create vulnerability, so this also could influence interactions. Poorly designed facilities create blind spots that increase opportunities for assaults and contraband trafficking. limited officer presence in high-risk areas, reduces response efficiency during incidences, and older buildings may lack modern security features, making it harder to monitor inmate activity effectively. You want to know why I put this in here, for example, just so you know? I think our interactions with the inmate really is dependent on how safe we feel in the environment. I truly do agree with that. I agree that we have to always make sure, obviously, we're doing the job safely, but we also would like the facility to ensure our safety to some extent. You know, I mean, are we working at a facility that's understaffed but still allowing the inmates to come out? You know, are we issuing rules that, you know, are tough for us to enforce because I don't have the backup in case I'm challenged? So I think knowing the layout and understand the security challenges does have a level of influence on how I am going to deal with the inmate interaction. Like, as I said, there are times where if I feel that I'm not going to be backed up or there's not a team to come to my aid if I chase after a contraband item, I'm probably not going to chase after it. You know, if the inmate has a cell phone, I decide I'm going to run after the cell phone, but then realize I don't have any backup because they're all out on trips. Maybe it's not in my best interest to get that cell phone at that moment. You know, if I'm an officer working the floor, maybe at that point, I'm just going to have to take note of it, pretend I didn't see it, and then go ahead and be more strategic. And when I decide to take it away, I know there's a lot of people here that when they interact with the inmate, they may go a little too far to go after something, not realizing that they could be putting themselves or others at risk. That's why we tend to, we've always tell people, no contraband's worth your life. You know, there's always a strategic way to get the contraband in a manner that's as safe as possible. But the last thing we want are for officers to be wrestling the contraband from the inmate, unless it's unless it's an immediate need because it's a safety and security concern at that moment. I have seen people in an open dorm interact with an inmate, and then they may catch in the corner of a corner of their eye, an inmate with a cell phone. Now, there could be many reasons why that inmate wants to protect that cell phone. There could be many reasons why other inmates in an open dorm want to protect that cell phone. So you got to assume that's not going to be an easy thing for you to get and should not be something that you do on your own. That rather, let me call for backup. Let me try to, if I can, control that area a little bit. But for the most part, the key is I need backup, and then we need to rip up this whole dorm. But I do believe that the layout and your resources do matter. So I'll start with Joe first. What's your thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, the physical plan of each facility is one thing. You know, pre-camera days, you know, there were a lot of blind spots, a lot of dark places, a lot of, you know, places that we knew of, you know, and the inmates damn sure knew them. You know, they would, you know, give them the staffing levels. You know, that's where all of their businesses were conducted. If it was a empty cell on a cell block, if it was if there was an empty bunk on the dorm, you know, that's where they're going to hide the contraband, because they're not going to be dumb enough to keep the contraband on their person. You know, so I always stressed, you know, looking at empty cells and looking at empty lockers and stuff like that, you know. But your physical plant, you know, there's a lot of blind spots. You know, you fast forward 20 years, you know, my last unit of assignment had over 900 cameras on it. And, you know, the cameras are a good thing documentary wise. But that's about all they're good for, is documentary wise, you know, because, you know, the staff would sometimes go and chase that contraband, and, you know, I'd have to, you know, tell them, you know, when to pick and choose these battles, because, you know, and their response is, well, we got all these security cameras. A security camera is not going to keep you from getting your ass whooped. It's just going to document that you got your ass whooped over, you know, chasing an extra t-shirt or, you know, something stupid. You know, if it's dangerous contraband, by all means, you know, call me, let me know. We'll form a game plan, try not to make it noticeable that, you know, that they have this contraband. And we'll formulate a game plan, because, you know, the cameras are a false sense of security to a lot of people outside, exterior to the profession of the corrections. Politicians think that, you know, these cameras are there for our safety. And again, a lot of them are benign and stupid to the fact that, cameras are there to document. Cameras don't save. They're not going to save an employee from being assaulted. They're not going to save somebody from committing suicide. They're not going to save somebody from smoking K2. They're just there to document these incidents. So, having a facility with a lot of blind spots, it's integral to know your facility, know where these blind spots are, walk by them, walk through them, let the inmate population see you walk by them, walk through them, because they know they're being monitored. That's the main thing. Being proactive, walking around, like Butch said, leadership by walking around. I mean, you have to do it. You have to do it. Even if you have no intended purpose, walk it anyway, because the more that you're seeing in these areas, the inmates know that they can be monitored at any time. So, that's about the only leg up we have on that, and it does cause us issues, because we know there's blind spots. We know we can't cover them all at one time. We can't be everywhere at one time. So, again, it's cops and robbers. It's their job to get away with it, and it's our job to catch them.
Yeah, and you know what? You touched on something that I want to elaborate on, because I think it's something that people should be aware of. Inmates do know the environment a lot better than we could ever imagine, probably in some cases a lot better than we do, because they're there every day. So they know the blind spots. They know when it's critical staff, and believe it or not, they know. And I think one thing that you have to be wary of as an officer is when you're having these interactions with these inmates, where are you having these interactions? Always be aware of the interactions, the locations, because sometimes inmates could put you or force an interaction with you in an area that is not widely covered, where they want to engage in something where it's like, you know what, let's take this out more in the public area. I don't feel like having this conversation in the hallway. It's not a time for a conversation. Let's just bring it out so at least people could see where I'm at, because the last thing you want is to be put in a blind spot and then no one knows where you're at. And also the timing of it matters. If inmates may know, well, if we're locked down today, I know probably we don't have enough staffing. So this is the time maybe I want to act a little bit foolish, and then knowing that the response could be a little bit more delayed. So they also know when the dynamic has shifted. So for us, our dynamic is truly reliant on our environment. It's true. We need our environment. We need to make sure that we're strategically where we need to be. And we also need to make sure we have the resources in play to handle any concerns that could just come up. The advantage comes when the inmates already know that the environment is a bit against us. And now there could be a shift. And you have to be wary of when that environment or the resources are not there to back you. And, to be honest with you, man, I hate when you have these forced interactions, and then when you look back and let's say, for example, it's like, hey, did you have that dialogue when you were in the inmate cell? Because it says here on your report that you were talking in the inmate cell. How did the inmate get you into the cell? You know what? I wasn't even thinking. We had this dialogue, and I wind up chatting, and that what the hell are you doing in an inmate cell? Are you not wary of the environment you're in? I mean, sometimes they'll engage you as your best friends and hoping that you'll go into their cell. And next thing you know, a bunch of shit can go wrong, but not being wary of the location and not understanding the resources that you have that day. That could be very detrimental to the facility, to your well-being, to everybody's well-being. What's your thoughts on that, James?
So although the newer, younger correctional officer won't have a whole lot to do with this, what I'm going to talk about, but it's important that these agencies that have a number of different facilities and jails that have different facilities, that they have a classification system that identifies the maximum security inmate that requires the most amount of security based on the physical layout and security of the facility, of the physical plant, as opposed to those inmates that can be managed in a least restrictive facility layout, and that they don't confuse those two. And they have a system in place where they constantly monitor that so that we don't put the most dangerous inmates in the facility that has the most challenging facility layouts. it's important to make sure that minimum security inmates and maximum security inmates are housed in separate, different separate facilities or different separate physical layouts, because when they don't, the minimum security inmates are always going to be beat up and abused, and that's where all the stronger inmates and the weaker inmates and all of those issues that result in having a classification system that's ineffective.
Yeah, that's powerful because that's truthful. And again, guys, that's why it's good to have good communication between frontline and management, because you know, management kind of looks at the folders and kind of makes decision based on paperwork, where I think frontline makes decision based on real time. I do. And again, that's not an absolute, but I think we get the generalized picture there. I think for a majority of the decisions that management makes, it's usually through paperwork and stuff because they're a little bit far removed. But the decisions that frontline must make are usually based on real-time moments. Okay, so I have the emotional and physiological warfare between officer and inmates, kind of like the us versus them mentality, which I actually I don't like to have that mentality. I think that's a bit aggressive. I'm not saying it's us with them, but it could be us and them, still a separation, and definitely not us or them, because that crosses it to verse. So inmates test your patience, resilience, and professionalism. Losing control of your emotions means losing control of the situation. So I got some inmates intentionally wear down officers mentally by constantly pushing boundaries. You know what's funny with that, if I may mention that? Usually when you have senior officers and they're kind of just maybe burned out or whatever it is, inmates will employ persistency. That's what they'll do, because they know if I'm more persistent, as I mentioned before, it's a battle of energy. All I got to do is outlast the officer. Most likely the officer just maybe is tired or exhausted. And at that point, the inmate knows if I'm a bit more persistent, maybe the officer will weaken. And I usually find that that tactic more utilized with old timers than I do with newer staff. I definitely find that persistence, especially when you're disenfranchised, could work in the inmate's favor, sadly. Officers who take inmate behavior personally rather than professionally become easier targets for manipulation. And we talked about that. And then prolonged exposure to conflict and stress affects both job performance and personal well-being. Now, guys, this is really about self-awareness. I want to mention that. If you're aware of yourself and your emotions and you're very in tune to who you are, this actually serves in your benefit. When you don't, and you don't understand how to control your emotions, you don't understand when you take things a certain way or whatever it is, and you don't really have a knowledge of who you are, inmates are going to take advantage of that gap because they're going to take that as a weakness. I think officers that survive in this profession have a true understanding of who they are at the very core of their being. And the officers that don't understand who they are wind up getting shaped by the environment. And then they wind up actually being exhausted mentally because they're just constantly shifting emotionally. And then eventually the inmate takes advantage of that. And rule enforcement at that point, really, as I mentioned before, becomes based on how you feel and not exactly what's the right thing to do. And that can go on both sides, aggressive or too soft. What's your thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's all like Joe says, it's the biggest game of cops and robbers going, and emotional and psychological warfare. I think that the officers need to be on the forefront of that. I think they need to be the ones that, are steady and consistent in their presentation and how they look from day to day, how they carry themselves when nobody's looking. All of those types of things will help you establish who you are in the core, and that the impact that working in a prison or a jail isn't really going to shake that all that much. But it's something that young correction officers and seasoned correction officers need to pay attention to all the time, because you're working in some dark places. You're seeing some dark things happen, and it can affect you. And you need to exercise to stay strong in that warfare And a lot of times you need to be on the offense by the way that you carry yourself and by the way that you work from day to day, from hour to hour, to minute to minute in that correctional facility. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to fall off that. You're going to lose your temper, maybe lose your composure on different, from time to time. But you really have to be on the offense with that warfare and be a war fighter in that process, because the inmates are gonna, and it's not healthy to be on the defense all the time. But you've got to maintain who you are and not let that place affect you.
You know how strong that is. Sorry, where's Joe? You know how strong that is, because if you look at it as us versus them, and you carry off that every interaction with the inmate has to be a win-loss, which means that if they get what they want, it's a loss for me. If I get what I want, it's a win. You're always shooting for the win, especially when you can't control the outcome. That becomes very tiring. And to carry that out for 25 years, you got to ask yourself, is that the facility or is that the agency putting that pressure on you? Or is that you? Have you somehow filtered everything we've ever taught you to mean that it's us versus them and that it's win or loss? And I mean, granted, guys, you could still be alert and not be paranoid, and I think that's the concern. I think for officers that make this into a war where a battle, every interaction with an inmate is a battle, that's not what we're trying to get across. Yes, there's strategic maneuvering, but it's not a battle. It's just more of being prepared to engage. The only time you really want to employ anything aggressive is when you feel at some point you're at a last resort where, okay, I've gone from asking for cooperation to the point where I'm telling the person for compliance, and now it's got to the point where it's about compulsion. I have to force. And now it's a little bit different in how assertive you need to be. But I think a lot of times the pressure we put on in this area could be the pressures on how we subjectively filter what's being thrown our way. And again, not every interaction is about winning or losing. It's about getting the job done, and it's not to be taken personally. What's your thoughts on that, Joe? I'm sure that's harder. What is it? Easier said than done?
Yeah, for sure. I've been at that point as a correctional officer on the burnout side. But anybody with any kind of tenure in the corrections profession, they'll know whether it's them working too much or if it's something that the facility is forcing the hand on, that causes the burn down or the flame out or, whatever the case is. Anybody with any tenure will know if it's them or the facility. So, your veteran staff, you tend to handle things a little more effectively than, say, somebody that's got 8 months in the system or, a year in the system. And, within that year, they've seen the staffing levels drop critically. And, now they've gone from working one pod to working 3 pods or more. So your veteran staff handle things a little more better because they have themselves already established, whereas the rookie officers still trying to find their way and get themselves established. So I think your rookie officers are more at a vulnerability of explosion than your veteran staff. Now, I'm not going to sit there and tell you that I've never lost my shit with one, because I've lost my shit with quite a few of them in my time. But they also knew that when I told you something, I meant it. And if it didn't happen, I was going to get compliance one way or the other, regardless if I was by myself on, with 500 inmates or, if I brought the team. But, that's just something that you go through. You don't have just the internal stressors of the correctional field. You got the external stressors of, you're working all these hours, you're spending even your days off at work, your family feels like they're second seat to your profession. You got all this shit going on in your head, all the while you got a whining and crying inmate, whining and crying because he didn't get this or he didn't get that. And, there's days where you come in, and I'm telling you, I've been there, with everything going on in my personal life and trying to maintain my professional life. And, this inmate's whining and crying because he didn't get an extra half a cookie. I really give a shit. But, mentally, you got to find that medium balance, between being able to deliver yourself effectively, even though you're tired, even though, without, being a cave in. Sad as it is to say, I wish a lot of the DOCs and counties as well spent as much money and resources in finding ways of dealing with the employees' mental health as they do with the inmates' mental health. My last facility, and I'll tell you, well, not my last facility, but my second to my last facility. I had a chaplain who was jam up. He would come in just out of the goodness of his heart and go, at my request, I'd have him go post to post, talk to the officers, see if there's something that they want to get off their chest. And I tell the chaplain, if it's something that's security related and you think it's a concern, tell me. If not, then let them get it off their chest, and I found that helped a lot too, and, the chaplain would come in and pray with them, give them some sort of emotional lift to let them know that, they're not alone in the venture. Somebody outside the security profession is thinking about them too. So, there's things that we can do to offer a little bit of hope and guidance to our retiring staff. Like I said, I've been there. I don't know what the correct answer is, but, I do know that you cannot let your emotional well-being compromise your effectiveness and your professionalism to the point that, you're lashing out. Because eventually it's going to lead to some sort of physical altercation that, we may or may not be able to get staff to you in time for.
Yeah, and I want to add something to this because you guys are spot on. I want to say that, inmates are conditioned to the uniform, so you can't hide behind the uniform. You don't have, like you would on the streets, there's an initial impression of the uniform that sometimes forces compliance because it's not, well, on the streets, it's not, we don't usually encounter law enforcement officials at that capacity. So usually because it's a unique situation, the presence of the uniform, the lights, all this other stuff can create an initial impression for you that forces you into compliance. It's just how it is. Where in corrections, it doesn't work that way. You can't hide behind the uniform and expect compliance because the inmates, their condition, they see right past the uniform. So with this said, this is about you as an individual, and you have to expect resistance. This is corrections. You have to expect resistance. And if you turn that resistance into something personal, you're going to have yourself a very long career because the moment you make it impersonal, the moment you internalize it, inmates are going to push your buttons. The three things they say about officers are inmate pushes buttons, admin pushes policies, and outside pushes opinion. And I think when it comes to this immediate level, you have to be wary. If you expose your buttons, inmates are going to push them. So with that said, you got to make sure that you are invested in what you're doing. Don't get me wrong, but you got to put a balance of how far that investment is. You take onus of your work, but at the end of the day, it's not personal. And again, like corrections, everything is balanced. So you have to figure it out what best works for you. And one more thing about this, and I think this will be a discussion that, that could go on its own, but, you're taught the trade of how to work corrections, how to do the job. But the funny thing is, I don't know if they really teach people how to carry their authority or how to deal with that authority when it's challenged. And I think the biggest inconsistency in corrections, and I know a lot of people will say, well, it's policy and procedure nationally. And I don't think that's the biggest inconsistency. I think at some point we kind of know what works and what doesn't work through the lifeblood of any facility. But I think the biggest differences are how we interact with inmates, because there's so many variables that come in play that each interaction is different. And now times every interaction across the country or across the world. So what we're trying to do is manage a generalized consistency and a good generalized contextual argument that will help bring good consistency is don't take it personal. I know everybody says it, don't take it personal. What does that really mean? I just told you what it really means. and it's not as easy said and whatever, easier said than done, but, or it's easier said than done. Let's just do it that way. But having said that, don't take it personally. Carries so much meaning that it's not a throwaway word. This was what we just talked about right now, was how you define that word in context. All right, so the next one I got. This matters. Poor staff training and lack of professional development. So an untrained officer is a liability to themselves, their peers, and the institution. So officers without proper de-escalation training may overuse force, escalating avoidable conflicts. A lack of training in inmate psychology and manipulation tactics leave officers vulnerable. Part of the reason why I wrote my books. And then failure to stay updated on policies and security risks can lead to preventable breaches and liability issues. So, Joe, you go first, Joe. I mean, this is a big thing now with staff training, lack of professional development. I mean, how does that play out into every inmate interaction, knowing now that we have more interactions with the inmate population than we ever have before?
Yeah, we call it the bullet in the foot because, you know, we have a record number of staff leaving the profession now because we're not properly training them. We're not giving them any kind of resources that they need to succeed in the profession. You know, I remember back in the day, you know, we were trained in the academy. We were given the basics. You know, we got to a unit. We were taken under the wing of a seasoned officer. And at some point, you know, we started getting groomed by sergeants and lieutenants to start knowing their jobs because they knew they weren't going to be there forever and they wanted somebody to step up into their position, you know, and that's the way it should be. You know, we should be giving these guys the tools and the development they need to succeed, the knowledge. You know, we're just giving them the basics and throwing them into a 40% staffed facility and expect them to be able to take the leads and run with it. And the inmates know this. The inmates know that these guys are green under the gills coming in here, and they're going to use that to their advantage. You know, and it's shooting us in the foot because, you know, we're basically self-inflicting injuries because we done spent 6 to 8 weeks training these guys, and once they get to a unit, boom, that's it. Because they're so short-staffed that there's nobody that's able to take them under the wing. They basically are hitting the ground running, you know, they're basically carrying on a CO5's job at CO1 level, without the knowledge and the experience. And, you know, it's something that, you know, I understand their recruiting intentions. They're trying to get ahead of the staffing curve. They want to beef up the numbers. But it doesn't do any good to get 500 people in the door when 480 of them quit because they have no knowledge. They have no training. They feel invalued. You know, there's a whole multitude of things. And if they feel invalued, I promise you an inmate's going to find value in them, you know, of some sort, whether it's love or whether it's contraband or an inmate will take care of that valuability for you. So, you know, poor training and lack of any kind of professional development, you know, I may not have gotten to talk to my staff every day on their duty post. For the most part, I got to walk around, and sometimes, you know, if time permitted, and, you know, I had great sergeants underneath me that knew how to carry my load. I would let them run my job, and I would go give officers a break so they can go get a cigarette, go get a soda, go get a cup of coffee, whatever, and run their area for them. You know, just the little things, but, you know, I didn't always get an opportunity to do that, and they knew when I could, I would. But during that shift briefing for 45 minutes, I promise you, they were learning something new every day. I was putting some sort of knowledge in their head that they could carry forward with them and use that day. And that's something that we need to get back to instilling again. You know, we use the short staffing and we use the lack of time. You know, well, I'm a busy lieutenant. I got this going. I got that going. Okay. What did you do for 45 minutes during shift mount? Did you just call out a roster and sit there? I mean, you know, there's plenty of time to teach them something. Give them some sort of different knowledge every day. Give them a new tidbit, you know, just something. to keep them motivated, to keep them moving forward. The worst thing you can have is a staff that are stagnant, because if they feel stagnant, you're not gonna get your best from them.
Yeah, and I want to mention something before we get to James. You know, a lot of the books I've written were somehow put together because I wanted to manage a gap between, what someone comes in knowing and where that experienced staff member could teach them. And sadly, a lot of senior staff are leaving. So these books have, in my mind, been more essential because I don't know if, when someone's entering this profession, who are they partnered with? Are they partnered with someone that really does have the experience? Are they partnered with somebody that's disgruntled, doesn't want to teach them anything? Or are they partnering with somebody who tends to only have 2 years more than them? I mean, there's just so much training that I felt was lacking. And one of the things that Joe mentioned too, when it comes to training, is that, as we move forward in corrections, there's a lot of concerns right now. We know understaffed and overworked staff, a bunch of concerns. And the changes, unfortunately, that are happening that make staff feel more ineffective. So if staff feel more effective, then you figure that the inmates are going to feel more entitled. So now, with that said, there are certain things where if you're teaching staff, okay, you got to be zero tolerance, sweat every rule, at the very beginning of your career, and then and take away what these inmates have and lean on policy and procedure at the very beginning. And then you put them in a close custody unit where that's just the opposite. Inmates have nothing to lose. So now you're trying to tell the staff they got to be zero tolerant, write up everything, but that doesn't work in a more highly restrictive unit, when at that point it's strategically giving inmates things back because they've already lost all their privileges. And now there's a training gap there because, I got to teach these officers an effort to have zero tolerance so they can embrace conflict and lean on policy and procedure to enforce rules so they have some confidence until they can build it on their own. But then you put them in an environment that's just the opposite of that, where it's not about what you could take away, but how you give it back, and not to have a senior officer next to them to teach them how to manage what I would call discretionary enforcement, which is really what's needed in those more close custody units. And the problem is, when it comes to developing policies and stuff, is that when that becomes the norm and you have rookies that are trying to manage their way in more close custody units, where really inmate behavior, as I said, is managed through the strategically giving things back, and the officers, they're new, they don't know how to do this. It's not as easy as I'm saying. I mean, there's a lot going on with that, including an understanding of the expectation of that officer, which a rookie is one, they don't have it for themselves, let alone for an inmate to know what that is. They're new. And also the rookie doesn't have a reputation to lean on that helps govern the unspoken to the inmate population. So then what happens here is that we start micromanaging the rookies as if that's the concern, and we try to make it easier for them by, putting more policies in play, whatever it is, and trying to help the rookie, when really that's not the issue. The rookie needs to develop some time before they can go into those units. The issue is we need more senior staff to get there and teach them from that experience level how to employ through time discretionary enforcement and the strategic efforts to give stuff back. But here's the problem. Once you start making this a very layered process, because you're trying to have the unit work in accordance to the rookie's needs, which is really not the right thing to do. With that said, if you do get senior staff that can come in and try to teach the officer how to maneuver, they're micromanaged because all these policies have been developed that eliminate the senior officer's empowerment. So now the problem is the senior officer can't teach discretionary enforcement, can't teach any level of strategic discretion or the strategic giving things back, because you've written everything down. And a senior officer can't run a unit that way, let alone now try to teach a rookie that way, because that's not how those units run. And I think that's a big concern, because we're trying to go ahead and create policies in areas that really need discretion, that really need empowerment. I mean, granted, there's still parameters. I mean, we know that we're inside a map somewhere, and we can't go outside the map, but to sit there and micromanage every letter because you want to protect the rookie, and that's the default. Well, then the problem is when you decide to put a senior officer in there, they really can't do much because every effort has been told to them. And at this point here, they wind up becoming frustrated, disenfranchised, like we talked about before, and they wind up saying, nah, screw that, because at the end of the day, this is not how I ran it. Remember, these type of units are really run by the empowerment of the front line with the support of the supervisors. It's not run by every step being micromanaged, because if you do it that way, the inmates will know how predictable you are. And when they know that you're predictable to that level that's beyond professional predictability, I'm talking about enforcement predictability, the problem is that they'll ultimately run the unit. That's why you get rookies that may come up and say, well, I'm writing these inmates charges in these close custody units. Why aren't they sticking? Because technically in the close custody units, unless they're emergent, you know that you're going to have to tolerate some of that, but your power comes from strategic enforcement or some level of discretion in giving things back that they want within the parameters of how long you could take it away. So I'll give you an example. If you have an inmate that loses something that they want for, let's say, a year, then, maybe you can give it back before a year, as long as they're good. And let me tell you something right now. One last thing. You know what a good senior officer knows? And this is the truth that a rookie will never know. So remember, a senior officer comes in with a level of expectation if the inmates know them, or at least a reputation. So there's something that the officer has in their benefit. But I'll tell you something right now. When you're a senior officer and you know your inmates, I know the length of time where whatever is punitive serves its best value. I know for some inmates, it may be quick because they're not ready to handle anything long-term. So I got to be very wary with them. And there's some inmates that, they could sit on things for a while. And the beauty of a senior officer is they know how to manage a punitive behavior to the point where the inmate doesn't become hopeless. They just know how to manage that time frame. And you can't expect at that level of restriction for an inmate where they don't have anything to lose. You cannot expect a rookie to understand how to manage those discretionary efforts. That's my thing with that. Go ahead, James. Sorry, there's a lot there, I know, but I wrote a book on that.
I don't even know how to follow that up, Anthony. I'm sitting here going, you just nailed it, but what's the answer? The outcome.
That's why I gave it to you, James. Give me the answer.
The outcome is what's important, right? But you have to have things in place to monitor the outcome, to make sure that outcome is something that, you can have a quiet unit and everybody behaving, but behind the scenes is, they're cutting a hole in the wall. And that's exaggerating. But do you see the dilemma? There's got to be rules. I guess, everything in moderation. But to stay on track with this, staff training and staff development, it's critical. You can't allow folks total expertise or to mold correction officers over experienced correction officers organically. There's got to be some formal teaching and some formal guidelines and some formal outcomes that are established and how we get there. And if we don't, correction officers, the correctional field is famous for coming up with their own. And I can guarantee you those standards will be lower than what needs to be set if they're not monitored and established by people who have been placed in charge. I think, wow, we could you hit it right on the head and kind of stumped me a little bit, but it's important that we officially teach and mold our staff to meet the demands that we have ahead of us. Otherwise, they're going to come up with their own. But there is balance. And you've always been a person, ever since I've met you, Anthony, you've always been a person that was, would stray away from the micromanage and letting people make decisions. And on the other, part of the spectrum, people who are in charge are hoping, hope is not, they're hoping that, when we do give that freedom, that it doesn't backfire. But let me tell you something right now. Hope is not a strategy. You've got to have some checks and balances in place. And I think that's where training comes in.
I agree. And guys, again, maybe the answer is right now is like James and Joe are kind of discussing, is that you got to understand, and this is just real quick, you got to understand what you're looking to accomplish, and then make sure that when you look to accomplish it, that doesn't affect what's could work already is working. Because again, we're looking to, let's say, micromanage the rookies, not realizing in our effort to do that, we're not empowering the senior staff. So technically, maybe the direction isn't micromanaging the rookies, but to do something more with the senior staff, because we need long-term fixes, and a long-term fix is never done through micromanagement, because it just leaves staff with deferred responsibility, limited innovation, and in close custody units, you need staff that could be innovative. You need staff that have some level of discretion. But again, it's usually developed through experience. So I guess there's training that can give you foundation, but you got to be very wary of the stuff that you put on top of it that starts to limit discretion, because what winds up happening is you just put in place things for liability upon liability upon liability without realizing that you're creating bigger liability, ultimately in the long run. So this is a good one, and we'll start with James first. I have lack of administrative support and policy shifts. So when officers feel unsupported, discipline becomes discretionary and order collapses. And one of the things that James touched on before is that an officer's main job is accountability. They can't get so disenfranchised with the outcome that they stop doing their job. If you want to chase a charge, chase it to learn, not to win. At the end of the day, there could be many reasons why an inmate beats a charge, but at the end of the day, none of it should discourage you from writing them. Your job ultimately is to hold people accountable. The moment you stop writing them is the moment you accept it, and you will get in trouble at one point when you should write something that you didn't, and then you try to blame the system for not supporting your charges. Your job is to keep on doing it, and just, you do your job and let the chips fall where they may. And I know that's harder for some, but the point is that is your job. The moment you stop holding inmates accountable, then to be honest with you, you're not really meant to be in that position. I have frequent policy changes regarding discipline, use of force, and privileges create uncertainty for both staff and inmates. Officers who lack clear backing from administration may hesitate to enforce rules, fearing disciplinary action or public scrutiny, and inconsistent messaging from leadership weakens institutional authority, leading to inmate defiance and other frustrations. I want to mention something before we go into this, James. Sometimes frontline will make an assumption that they truly understand why a certain decision didn't go in their way, and usually that assumption is could be very negative in its filter, very, very biased towards a negative way. That's why, as management, if we could let people know, we should, because we don't want them to filter, because it will never filter in favor of management. It will always filter through some bias that affects management and their decision. But what happens here is sometimes management ain't able to say things, I get it, and then there's this assumption that management has did it again, and they're coming after James for doing this or coming after Joe for doing this, when the details are not really out there. The details of why they did what they did is not put out to Front Street, because you can't. So what happens is management can't challenge the gossip, and then people start believing the gossip because management can't mess with the due process. So you got people making an interpretation or an assumption of what they feel management is doing. And at the end of the day, that's not the case. It's just may not have all the information of why management had to make that decision. And unfortunately, gossip eventually becomes fact. And next thing you know, the front line winds up taking it as, well, I guess I can't do my job. I guess I can't do my job, because they have this interpretation of management that doesn't show support. But if they fully understood what had happened during that situation and why management made that decision, they may think, well, maybe this shouldn't really be generalized and applied everywhere. Maybe there is specific concerns with James and Joe that we're not being told. And at that point that shouldn't stop me from doing my job, because I'm not James and I'm not Joe, especially when it comes to use of force. Sometimes people will make an interpretation that a use of force that maybe they're being disciplined over, basically maybe, well, it's crazy because all the officers did was this, and it's because the inmate did this, and now they're coming after us, so we should never use of force. But then the video shows something totally different. It wasn't such a simple officers did this or, the inmate did this. Maybe there was something that the officer could have de-escalated that they made worse. Or maybe there were some things on the slide that you don't know about because the officer didn't put it in their report. So at the end of the day, we may assume that we know why management made that decision, and we could be wrong. And the problem is now we're making ourselves hesitant. And the moment you don't do your job when you're supposed to do your job, the moment you're not effective and you try to blame, everybody else, management, for whatever they're doing, then you find out that your facts are totally wrong, that you don't know the reason behind a lot of decisions that were made. You're going to wind up getting caught up and not doing your job. And you're not going to have an excuse, because at the end of the day, I think a lot of the stuff that's tearing us apart, especially between management, frontline, or even department to department, is an assumption. It's what we assume the other side is thinking, and then our negative filter to complete our subjective narrative. When at the end of the day, when that person, realizes that, I'm going to go challenge it, I'm going to go speak to someone, and all of a sudden the assumption gets lifted, and management or whoever is able to go back and tell them the specifics. It's like, holy shit, I've had this all wrong. Yeah. And you've been doing your career based on that assumption. And now the problem is you're going to be held responsible, because at the end of the day, you ran with that assumption. And I don't mean to be an asshole, but at the end of the day, guys, assumption to me is one of the biggest threats in corrections, because all assumption does is divide. And if the assumption goes on long enough, we tend to hold on to the negative perspective of it all. And all of a sudden, everything that happens, even like a bump with management, accidental bump, becomes an aggressive attack. And I think that we need to do more to alleviate those gaps of assumption, get rid of them. And really, if we have a concern, try to go ahead and knock the assumption out, as opposed to letting it live. That's why gossip is one of the worst things in corrections, because most likely gossip is unproven fact based on assumption, because nobody had the balls to go up to an individual and say, hey, what does this really mean? Because I'm hearing you did this. What's your thoughts on that? Go ahead.
So I think we try to be as transparent as we can, as the situation allows. Well, I don't think. I mean, I can only speak for myself. I just need to be forthcoming and tell people, answer questions. There are some situations where you're not going to be able to, explain fully based on an ongoing investigation or some personal confidentiality issues. You're not going to be able to share it with folks that probably need to know. But I think over time, some folks, supervisors, and develop some rapport with folks, and they've made the right decision, and and monitored and helped people along in their careers or in their assignments, and they develop a rapport and they trust you. So that's why one of the reasons that trust is one of the most important leadership trait out there. But it's tough to get there. It takes a long time. And you hit it right on the head again, Anthony, with these very difficult and complex issues. But I can tell that you're calloused from, experiencing them day after day, where, Yusuf, listen, our walls are so permeable now with the outside influence. It's unbalanced change that we experience a lot of the times. And as administrations, meaning, the commissioner on down, or the governor, or either the government, who we report to in the executive branch, have different ideas than CO Heathcliff or CO Smith. And, they have different, and I'm not saying they're right or wrong. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of influence on this profession. It's no longer a closed door profession where, we ran our own institutions. I remember when the wardens hardly ever heard from central office. Now, the wardens, their power's almost been stripped from the higher ups. They just do what they're told. They're micromanaged. They have a lot less ability to do freelance or to use discretion. So, it trickles downhill. But, that is one of the reasons why we have a lot of inexperienced managers, is
Mhm.
that the senior managers who knew what was effective in corrections, some of those tools in the toolbox have been removed. And now we're kind of trying to come back to trying to put things in place where we can probably do anything that you want to do, but at the same time, we want to make sure that when we do it, we keep our staff safe while we do it. And that's where the conflict comes in. But the outcome, again, sometimes is not what everybody wants when it comes to those personal issues and changing of policies and so on and so forth. That's why when we make mistakes in corrections, they sting a lot more than some other profession. It has a bigger impact on human life, on human behavior. With today's internet and TV and the way things are sensationalized, a mistake made in, let's say, New York impacts, the day-to-day operations in Anthony Gange's facility in New Jersey. But it's a challenge, and it's a battle. And my advice out there is to ask questions and to make up your own mind. If you're not getting answers and you don't trust the people, that's one thing. But if people are trying to be forthcoming and they're honest with you and tell you, hey, listen, I can't really talk about the details. We have to be met halfway sometimes, and that's hard for some of the people, But on the other hand, I understand it. There's been some unbalanced change in this profession where I don't understand. So I don't expect an experienced correction officer, sergeant, or lieutenant to understand it either. And it's hard for me to even explain it. Never mind understand it. So it's a challenge. We work in a very complex profession, and it's a challenge day in and day out. But communication is the best advice I can give to people. Honesty, building trust, and communicate. It's not going to be the best message all the time, but hopefully we, through communicating and talking about it, and understanding each other, we can mitigate the impact that stuff has.
Yeah, and guys, obviously, administrative support matters. That means we have to show appreciation more to our staff. Let them know that their efforts are appreciated. It also lets them know that they're heading in the right direction. And this is not recognition; this is appreciation. But I also want to mention one other thing too, for people from the outside that looking in, because this does matter during our inmate interactions. And I think that even if there is a what that you need to pass down, a what that must come, you got to allow the staff, the ones that are most affected by whatever that change is, to come up with the how. And they do that by understanding the why, as James was kind of saying. It's, you can't get to a point where you micromanage everything, because then if I'm management and I got to push this down and I got to get my staff to buy in, I have nothing for them to connect to. If you're going to sit there and tell me what they got to do and how they got to do it, it's going to be a losing battle for me to get them invested, because you took the two most important things that I need to get them to connect to. I need the how, most importantly, because that shows that we value their input. And at the end of the day, when I'm sitting at that table and I'm talking to my staff, and it's something that that has to be done, that's non-negotiable. When we have that discussion, I want people that are going to help me head in the right direction. It's like, okay, guys, listen, this is what it is. I'll even be the last person to speak because, I don't want to influence anything. But with that said, guys, this is what it is. Now, I don't want disagreement against it, because we have to do it. So I want everybody to know at this table, I'm not looking for agreement, because I get that a lot of people may not agree to this. So I'm not going to try to spend all day having this meeting and trying to get everybody's agreement, because I know that's not going to happen. But what I do expect at this table right now is an alignment of what I want and what's needed to be done. And the reason why I have everybody at this table is they're going to tell me how they want it to be done. And if you guys can't do it because you're purely resistant to what has to be done, then I will go ahead and I will make that decision, which you won't like. But then you can tell your staff how I gave you the opportunity to mitigate at least what, how it had to be done. whether you're in agreement or not, you chose not to. And now it's going to be a micromanaged effort. Because my job at this table right now is to make sure that when you go back and you talk to the people, that somewhere along the line, because I had to fight to get this how, that you translate the buy-in. So my staff now feels motivated to do the work because we took their opinion. We took value in what they had to say, and now we're going to use it to implement this greater initiative. But yeah, if there is no administrative support, then what happens here, or some level of appreciation, then staff get confused as to whether what they're doing or not is the right thing. And the last thing you want is for staff to be in a state of ambiguity. Because at that point, if they're in a state of ambiguity, they're going to be hesitant over every effort. And we don't want that, not in corrections. We need adapt, adjust, innovation, discretionary efforts. It's all needed in corrections. That's what leadership is. And in corrections, everyone needs to be a leader because the decisions you have to make. What's your thoughts, Joe?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'll start by saying that great leadership came from a career full of fuck-ups. Trial and error was the best thing that ever happened to me. People giving me knowledge and the latitude to do my job was probably one of the best things that could have ever happened in my career. And, I got to agree with Butch, administrative support has dwindled over the years. Wardens aren't even wardens on their facility anymore. They're more like administrative assistants to the regional directors. They don't get to call the shots on their own facilities anymore. They can't lock down their own facilities anymore without approval or guidance from, up on the hill. Used to be, when something was going bad, or we had a bad contraband problem, or officer got assaulted, we locked that facility down. And, we searched until we found the contraband, or we searched until, we got the suspect in the assault, and now, things have gotten to the point where, that the executive leadership is so scared to field complaints from the public about visitation, about, that they're more worried about outside opinions than they are about internal security. And, that kind of thinking trickles down. That trickles down to your regional directors. It trickles down to your senior wardens, your assistant wardens, and it just keeps going down the pike. One of the things that I loved about my job was I felt like as a lieutenant, I was the bridge between administration and frontline. I did everything in my power to hold the bridge steady, to keep everybody connected to one side or the other. I always welcomed a senior warden to come to my shift briefings at any given time. I did not like being one of those lieutenants that went into a shift briefing and laid out a new policy, and when asked why, to say, well, because, Warden Ganji said so. I was never that kind of lieutenant. I never could do that. I always wanted to know the why. And if I knew the why, I would pass that why on to my staff. We're tightening up on this because this happened. We're tightening up on this because, over the course of the last 6 weeks, we noticed an influx of contraband coming in. I would always try to give them the why, because, a better understanding of what you're trying to implement goes a long way. Just bluntly and coldly implementing something with, a finality and no way of taking any input. Just it is what it is. This is what you're going to do, period. That is one way to get a disconnect from your staff. If you know the answer and you can divulge the answer without, giving out any kind of confidential information as, regards to an investigation or whatever, as long as it's not confidential information, man, involve your staff. All they want to know is why. Knowing a full picture and why is a lot easier to take than just, bluntly implementing things. I would always welcome, my captains, my majors, assistant wardens, senior wardens. Whenever y'all want to come to my shift briefing, you all just come on, don't ask, just show up. I loved it when they came because they got to field some of them questions and they got to see what a lieutenant goes through on a daily basis and that hunger for knowledge. And they kind of understand now that when they implement things, it has an impact even to the front line. So just throwing blanket policy changes out there has never been a good thing for me. I've never been a lead by memo kind of person. If I got something to say or something to implement it, I'm going to do it during a staff meeting, or I'm going to do it on a one-on-one basis if need be. But always, keeping your people invested and involved in the process is one of the best tools you can have as an administrator. It doesn't matter whether you have full control over the situation or not. You can still give them the knowledge and the tools to understand what's happening. Even if you don't like it yourself, and I've said it before, you got to be a car salesman. When something comes down the pike, you got to know how you got to be able to understand it and go back and sell it. And sell it in such a way that they can understand and almost enjoy it. Keeping your staff connected through the question and answer process, it's critical that you have that because, in the grand scheme of things, all your staff want to do is be part of the solution, not part of the problem. They just want to know what's going on so they have a better picture and don't feel like that they're being kind of stuck in a closet and only used when you need them.
Yeah, and guys, you obviously for the policy shifts, that should always be expected, whether it's a change or a sudden change. Usually the sudden change is the one that are most affect us because it's so rapid that we don't have a chance to adapt or adjust. Same thing as I mentioned before with the inmate population. Sometimes these are done because of liability or just whatever it is. But the point is, I think for this case here, some of the hesitancy or some of the feelings that we're not supported may not be truly accurate. And we have to ask ourselves the right questions. I mean, is this really the truth or am I assuming it? And I think sometimes, if you just ask the right questions, you could tell that some of the things that we have against each other that's causing this verse dynamic or the feeling that we're not being supported is not rooted in fact. If someone starts asking you the questions, you start to find out it's a rumor mill. Or, well, I don't like the way management treated Joe. Well, who told you that? Well, Joe did. Well, Joe's probably not going to be objective because Joe's subjective just like everyone else. So you're creating this whole us versus them dynamic because the person that's upset with management told you their story. That's why I've learned in the long run, it's how you treat me. I'm not, it's just, that's the rule of thumb. It's how you treat me. If I have no issues with you, I'm not going to take on the issues of somebody else because at the end of the day, you never know what's truly accurate or not. And I'm not going to make my life any worse and have a 25-year shit career based on assumptions of what could be a disgruntled employee. It could be. Again, that's just a perspective. All right, so next one, we're wrapping it up, guys. A few more left, then we're done. A lot of stuff here, guys. All right, limited inmate rehabilitation and program availability. So idle hands inside a prison are dangerous hands. Insufficient access to educational, vocational, behavioral programs leave inmates idle, increasing tension and aggression. Without proper programming, inmates are more likely to engage in gang activity, contraband trading, or violence, and officers are left dealing with unmotivated, idle inmates rather than inmate working towards reintegration. I got to admit, guys, rehabilitation has helped me deal with the inmate population because to some extent, for most of them, it does keep them motivated. Obviously, there are some that can manipulate. I get it, manipulate their way into these programs, but there are some that truly do take some, make some changes based on what's being offered. And then we're able to now, as people that have to manage their behaviors, officers utilize that for our advantage. So always working with the program providers usually does work too, because I also like to believe sometimes the inmates like to sell an image to the program providers, but then they show the officers something else. So when they see that the officer and the program provider is working in tandem, working in partnership, there's no divide here, you start to find a consistent inmate. And it's true. If you feel like sometimes everybody automatically thinks like rehabilitation and safety and security contradict each other, which leads to departments that are extreme, conflict with each other. And that's really not the case. Technically, there's a working partnership that, always safety and security will always be a foundation, but sometimes it's, it balances out. And when you see rehabilitation and safety and security working together, and the inmates see that they're working together, it's funny how consistent the inmate will be across the platform, and it's true. Like if I'm working, as I said, if I'm working with the rehabilitation whatever, the program facility provider, whatever the program provider, and I have a good relationship with them, I could also utilize that in my advantage as an officer, especially if it's stuff that's not emergent, but rather little things that I feel this guy's starting to go into a negative pattern, or this female's starting to go into a negative pattern. Let me work with the program provider, and let me see if we can get ahead of it. But with that said, I always found a good working relationship with the rehabilitation and program people that facilitate it, and for people that don't, you're missing out on something very important that can help you maintain control during any inmate interaction you have with staff. I'll go with James first. What's your thoughts on that, James?
So, Anthony, I think that, rehabilitation programs, the availability, I truly believe that in many, the professional major states, Department of Correction, and even the Bureau of Prisons has a robust inventory of programs. It's very, very difficult, however, to get everyone in the cycle of improving, their lifestyle based on program availability. First of all, drug and alcohol, whether residential treatment units for drug addiction is in just about every Department of Correction. How effective they are, really, sobriety programs are basically, their effectiveness is based on truly how the participant participates. It's really up to them. We can put the program out there. However, it's really self-improvement. The other programs that we have, education, I think, is that one of the number one programs. Very, very difficult for corrections to get. Once we get inmates their GED, to get programming or educational programming after that becomes very cost an issue with budgets. We do have some, colleges that volunteer some services, and there are prisons out there where inmates can get their college degree while incarcerated. There is a ton of different things. I really think that corrections has gone, a long way with program availability. Now you'll hear that folks can't get in those programs, and there's waiting lists and so on and so forth. But it's really a day-to-day, operation in prison. Just about every day in corrections, there's some type of program or rehabilitation function going on inside the walls of, regardless of security classification. People went out of their way to get the tablets that promote and present and give the availability for every inmate to get some type of programming on that tablet. The profession has gone out of their way to give inmates the opportunity to make a better life. Whether they take advantage of that now, rehabilitation is a choice that the inmate makes. If we give them the opportunities and they choose not to, to get it, that's where the challenge is.
Yeah, and as I said, I think as rookies or just as officers in general, knowing which programs are there, having good connections with the people that provide those programs could be utilized as a tool. Joe, you have any thoughts on that? And I have two more left.
Yeah, when it comes to rehabilitation, it's only as good as the participant, will invest in. Rehabilitation to me 20 years ago, 30 years ago was lining them up 2 by 2, 200 people out the back gate with Aggies in their hand, and we were maintaining 100 acres worth of crops. We worked them hard. We fed them good. Some of them guys had to go to school half day to get their GEDs, or, were studying for college courses. Rehabilitation has come a long ways in that short time. To me, rehabilitation was giving them a job, give them something to focus on other than their addictions or, their crimes. We grew our own crops. We were a self-sustaining unit. We raised our own beef, raised our own pork, raised our own crops. So they got to see the fruits of their rehabilitation during each meal. And, sometimes at the end of the day, rehabilitation now is more centered around, mental health and drug addiction. We have substance abuse classes and courses, and even a lot of those now are short staffed. Some of these guys spend their days doing, worksheets in the cells instead of being in the classrooms. And I think that the substance abuse rehabilitation needs to be a lot more. I think it needs to be a lot more hands-on. And these guys are required to be in class for 8 hours a day. Some of them aren't even maybe seeing 2 hours a day. The rest of the time they're in their assigned living area doing worksheets. And to me, that's not rehabilitation. That's just my opinion. But I think there needs to be better program. One thing I can say is a lot of our facilities now are getting Department of Motor Vehicle terminals where, these guys can get ID cards and stuff prior to them getting out. They get them set up with identification where, 30 years ago when they got out, the only thing they had was their inmate ID card as identification. So, the rehabilitation side has come a long way into what we can offer a departing offender or somebody who's getting close to release. I do think that there needs to be a better structure on these programs. They're doing things by tablets now, and it's almost like a correspondence from home course, which I guess, if it works, it works, as long as the inmates invested in it. To me, I just don't see where they have any sense of personal connect to this. Instead of a classroom environment where you have a one-on-one with these counselors and teachers and stuff. And, due to limited, availability, it just, all it does is just higher the recidivism rate, because we're putting these guys out with virtually, a third to 2/3 less of what they were supposed to get when they were in these courses because of short staffing. And, all that does is put them right back to the same scene of where they were and starts that vicious cycle of them, reoffending all over again.
Yeah, guys. And the good thing about programming is in the long term, and I learned this at the very beginning of my career, the best way to manage inmates is not through reactionary rule enforcement, but rather through expectations. And then when you have programs that align with the needs of the facility, that give inmates goal and direction to be a better person, we can actually utilize that for leverage. It gives us a North Star that we can able to push the inmate towards through that expectation. So I do think there is a tremendous partnership, especially at this point, because there are increased interactions. So, that could be something that could be towards our benefit if we know how to utilize it. This one we don't really have to go over so much. We kind of know this, right? But the impact of media and public perception. So corrections is judged by its worst moments, not its everyday successes. Negative portrayals of correctional officers in the media lower morale and create public distrust. Fear of media backlash can lead to officers hesitating to use necessary force or discipline, making them less effective. And public pressure for reform often leads to hasty policy changes that compromise security without input from frontline staff. What's funny about this, guys, is this is what it is. That's why we're hoping to create venues that showcase the truth and doesn't kind of spin a negative narrative or try to generalize an incident as if this is the culture of corrections in general. So it's good to kind of be on top of that, defend it when need be, because at the end of the day, the people that are most affected by it are the people that do the job and identify with the job, identify what they do. Because then an attack on the profession is also an attack on that person as an individual. And again, if the media spins a half truth, you got to be there to spin a better truth. But that does affect how staff view the job. Unfortunately, if they feel that there is no appreciation for what they do, and I'm not talking about recognition. Recognition is superficial. I'm talking about appreciation. If you don't appreciate people for what they do, eventually they lose the will to do it. And what could be a purposeful career turns out to be nothing of value. I just want to go to this next one, then we can wrap it up because I know people got time. We've been doing a long show. This one I just wanted to expand a little bit more on. The psychological toll of long-term exposure to trauma. So you don't just work in corrections, you carry it with you. Officers witness violence, suicide, and medical emergencies regularly, leading to emotional exhaustion and PTSD. Repeated exposure to high-stress situations can desensitize officers, leading to either emotional detachment or heightened irritability. And lack of mental health resources and stigma around seeking support prevent officers from getting necessary help. So real quick, Joe, I'll go with you first, then James. How does this affect the inmate staff dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you carry any kind of long-term thoughts regarding incidents, you know, it's gonna mess with you, you know, and it definitely, you know, has a tendency of, especially if it's something where, you know, involves a staff and an inmate member, you know, regarding these incidents, you know, both sides are seeing what happened, you know, what's happened, and it could cause long-term issues, because, you know, when you see something that's happened that's so shocking that it sticks with you, you know, you have the tendency of either, you know, blaming yourself or blaming a person for it. And, you know, that could cause issues between, you know, staff and the inmate population later on down the road. You know, carrying it yourself, you know, especially when it comes to suicides or, you know, homicides. You know, I've seen both in the penitentiary. You know, most of them were, you know, most of the homicides were, you know, all the homicides were inmate on inmate. But it doesn't necessarily negate the fact that, you know, the inmate population is going to blame staff because they weren't there in time or didn't do anything to stop it, or, you know, whatever. Same thing with the suicide. You know, we didn't get there on time. We didn't get the door open on time. It took a while for staff to respond and get medical down there. All these things have a way of playing on the inmate population as well, because, you know, they're, you know, inmate, it's a team, just like the staff is a team. With inmates, when something happens to one of them, you know, they're looking out for the team at that point, regardless whether black, white, Hispanic. It's one of them, and, you know, that can cause aggravation between the inmate population and the staff dealing with the issues. You know, and there's sometimes where people second guess themselves. You know, when something happens, they start playing the woulda, coulda, shoulda game, and, you know, that's one of those games that's hard to, once you start playing, you never stop playing it. So, you know, it could affect the culture. It could affect, you know, the culture of the facility at some point. It's just something you deal with the best you can.
I agree. And what's your thoughts on that, James?
So listen, the stuff, and I think I mentioned this earlier, the stuff that we observe and go through on especially maximum and medium security facilities on a day-to-day basis is not healthy. It's not healthy for anyone. It's not healthy for the inmates. And a lot of times that's why the inmates are where they're at, is based on the amount of, you know, long-term exposure to some trauma stuff that they've seen at home and in the streets. It's not healthy, and it needs to be dealt with. I'm not, you know, a psychiatrist or a psychologist or anything like that, but I know that it's going to take more than you know, what a traditional occupation offers. We need to make sure that people are okay, and the people that work in these sites from day in and day out have the avenue or some type of process to help keep them healthy. And what that is, I'm not sure. You know, people do it in different ways. But in the long term, everyone's going to need something to help cope and to get back into the routine of a more normal life and activity. it does affect them, and it's something that it affects the way our facilities run today. Some of the problems that we have today are because of what officers have witnessed day in and day out at their sites. So people need to be safe at work, and when they're not, it's really a deterrent to the effectiveness of what we're trying to get done. It's a problem in corrections. It's a problem right now. It's been a problem, probably since its inception. And it is something that we need to pay attention to. Administrators need to pay attention to. Agencies and the government needs to pay attention to it.
Yeah, and I will say, from management side, especially for this, if you expect staff to be vulnerable, there has to be a trust. If there is no trust, staff will not admit when there are concerns. And right now, I think we understand that we need to address concerns. So we need to build an environment that showcases trust, because we don't want people that don't have the right mental mindset to be overseeing individuals in the role that we have them in, because at the end of the day, that creates even worse liability. I have a closing thing I just want to read off real quick, kind of wrap up the dialogue, and then we'll go for our closing remarks. I have correctional officers operate in a demanding environment where strong leadership, consistency, and officer resilience are key to maintaining order. United or unified staff and clear policies prevent manipulation, gang influence, and contraband flow, ensuring officers, not inmates, control the facility. Training and professional development equip staff to handle high-tension situations, recognize psychological tactics, and enforce discipline fairly. Facility design, resource management, and rehabilitation programs reduce violence, promote compliance, and minimize inmate idleness. Administrative stability and public perception shape officers' confidence, reinforcing authority and professionalism. Most importantly, officers' well-being and mental health support must be prioritized to combat burnout, trauma, and stress. By strengthening training, leadership, and institutional consistencies, agencies empower officers to take control, enforce order effectively, and create a safer, more professional correctional environment. Hey, James, any closing thought?
Well, you wrap that up in a couple of minutes.
What do you got? What do you got, James?
Just took us 3 hours to say all that. A lot easier said than done, though, huh?
Yeah.
It's a fascinating subject, what we talked about today. The fact is that we're talking about it and getting it out there is a positive. I hope that, there's correction officers out there that listened to this and said, it struck a nerve, at least some of the stuff that we said, and gives them some relief as to, someone understands or gets what I was thinking last week on the job. And hopefully it helps them, to take that next step forward. It's one day at a time in corrections. And I really appreciate the opportunity to get my opinion out there, and maybe it'll help somebody.
That's the key, man. That's why we do it, and it's great to be able to look back after your career and see what moments really did have value, share that experience, because you never know what people could take from it. I wish I had this advice, early in my career as well. Joe, what's your thoughts? Closing remarks.
Well, we spent a lot of time touching on a lot of key points and subjects. The main thing I want to put out there is for the correctional officers, for the rookie correctional officers watching this, understand the fact that we know where you're at. We know what your concerns are, because we were once you. May have been a long ass time ago, but we were once you, and we had the same concerns. The main thing you can do is be aware, be correctionally aware, play the what if game, always ask questions. Be significant and be part of the solution. Don't let the woulda, coulda, shouldas drag you down. Don't think that, because some supervisors are silent, that they're strong arming you. Some of these supervisors are busier than a one-legged man in an ass kicking contest. And I can attest to that, because I've been that lieutenant that has been so busy. There's been times where I didn't see my COs for 2 days. And thankfully I had great sergeants underneath me that knew what my vision was, knew what my direction was, and were able to carry that out for me. But don't ever let it, dissuade you from coming and ask questions. They say the only question not asked is the one you'll never get an answer to. So be inquisitive and understand that, for the public, I've heard so many different public sayings about the corrections professions. Trained monkeys can do your job. And that came from a politician, a governor at that. I've heard, you guys don't do shit except for, you beat our loved ones, you do this and that. Anybody who is a member of the public, I invite you cordially to become a member of the corrections profession so you can get a full scope and understand what these people go through on a daily basis. It's not about us being mean to your loved ones. Hell, we spend 90% of our time trying to save your loved ones and doing things to keep them protected and safe. I just wish the public and the media had a better glimpse to the inside of correctional workings. The county jail that I'm currently an administrator at, our sheriff is bringing senators, bringing church groups, all kinds of people in for tours so they can see the inner workings of a correctional facility. And a lot of them are shocked at what they see. It's something they don't get to see a lot of. And, seeing it from the inside gives them a better working and a better knowledge and a better understanding as to what, corrections professionals go through on a daily basis, especially in county jails. My God, coming to a county jail from DOC, at least, at the DOC, when we got them, they were off of whatever drugs they were on. At the county jail, baby, when I tell you that we see them at their lowest point in their lives, and that's what we have to deal with, it makes it difficult. And I take my hat off to the correctional professionals that do this every day, because it's hard. It's demanding work. It's, it makes you sacrifice time from your loved ones. It sometimes sacrifices your mental health. It can become overwhelming. But, like I said, once again, correctional officers and all the rookies coming into this profession understand that we understand. We've been there. We know, we see you, and we understand where you are.
And you know what? My closing remarks is someone showed me a meme a while ago. I just found it. So basically, we're talking about, how we want to have people on the same page. And I think there is a big gap of knowledge between rookies and our senior staff. And we're always trying to do shows to mitigate that. And there's a meme that says, when you're taking a test and everyone starts using a ruler, but you thought the answer was Abraham Lincoln. So it shows that I think I took this meme to relate to this, because we don't want that gap of knowledge. I expect that we're always going to have different ways of handling things, but we don't want it to be so extreme that people are using rulers and the other person's using Abraham Lincoln. So I think shows like this, it starts to put people in the right direction. So even though our answers aren't identical, they're at least aligned. I mean, that's the key. I think corrections right now needs more alignment. I think that's the word of the day right now. Needs alignment. Not agreement, alignment. We all have to understand where we're going, and we have to understand the direction to get there. And the funny thing is this, one last thing, guys, when we go over this dialogue, sometimes it's funny. We may get so caught up in looking for the right path that sometimes it's actually maybe more easier to understand what not to do. And that could get us on the right path. A lot of people may search for that definitive answer when at the end of the day, maybe they could discover the answer when they figure out that this ain't the path I want to go on. So I know a lot of people may, tend to focus so much on the solution that if they just maybe revisit the problem, the answer's there. They just got to figure out how to develop the path. And sometimes I like what Joe said. Sometimes it is through trial and error. So I don't think success and failure should be separated. I don't think we should be afraid of failure and disconnect it from success. I think we should bring them together, knowing that you really can't have one without the other. One, success keeps you motivated through failure, and failure keeps you humble through success. hopefully being teachable moments. You can learn a lot from success, but you can learn even more from failure. So don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. As long as they're not negligent, as long as they don't question your integrity, it's going to happen. As always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post my video. Stay safe.